Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. If looks could kill, Vegeta would now be a bubbling puddle of flesh, blood, and bone shards. It would have been a difficult thing for an observer to decide who exactly was the angriest of the three people glaring heatedly at the Saiyan Prince. Goten was upset and confused, not fully comprehending what was going on, but he understood that Vegeta had been the cause of his father's pain. Raditz, Trunks, and Bulma, however, were furious. Unfortunately for Raditz, he was too weak to act upon his impulse to throttle the 10-year-old boy who stared indifferently out the broken door of the capsule house. Trunks was barely managing to hold on to his rage by a thread because Vegeta was, after all, his father. Bulma, however, had no such compunctions holding her back. "You insensitive bastard," she screamed, hurtling her mug, cider and all, at the spiky-haired prince's head. Vegeta managed to dodge the glass, but the scalding liquid splashed all over him. The Saiyan yelped as the burning hot cider splattered onto his face, eliciting a string of curses with enough heat to boil ice. Giving Bulma his deadliest scowl, Vegeta swore again as he swiped his hand over his face. "What the hell do you mean, Chibiana? No ko," he snarled, one hand clenching into a fist. Bulma scowled right back at him, planting her fists on her hips. "You know exactly what I mean, vegetable head," she seethed. "You practically tore Goku's heart out. Kuso, why'd you have to tell him that?" "I refuse to entertain his childish self-delusions," the boy growled back, his tail lashing furiously behind him. Folding his arms, he lifted his chin imperiously. "I see no reason why I should not have told him he was the one responsible for his grandfather's." He spat the word out mockingly. "Death." Face turning a dark shade of crimson, the blue-haired girl could barely keep herself from physically attacking Vegeta. Only the thought of what had happened the last time she'd tried that held her back. "He's a child, Vegeta. How the hell would you feel if you just found you were the reason the only family you'd ever had was dead?" Despite the fact that the girl's shrieking voice grated on his ears, Vegeta smirked. "That is irrelevant," he replied casually, spitting contemptuously to one side. "The brat is a weakling to allow himself to be ruled by soft human emotions. Besides, the old man wasn't his family. He was just some pathetic weakling human who was too stupid to realize what he was getting himself into by taking a Saiyajin child in. He deserved what he got." "Why you stupid, stinking monkey," Bulma spluttered, unable even with her vast knowledge of insults to find one that could accurately describe her opinion of the 10-year-old prince. "Careful, Chibiana," Vegeta taunted, amused by her lame attempt at an insult. "If you keep that big mouth of yours open too long, you might catch a fly. Of course, you already look like a blue-haired frog, so catching flies is just the next step for you, isn't it?" Eyes flashing furiously, Bulma snapped back. "At least my hair doesn't look like a fly trap. Tell me, how often do you have to comb it just to get the dead bugs out?" Anger flashed across Vegeta's face, and he drew himself up to his full height, doing his best to stare down his nose at the slightly taller female. "Am the Saiyajin no OG. You will speak to me with respect," he barked, his words dripping with royal ire, "and I don't see why you're sticking up for that idiot third class. After all, he murdered his own grandfather, who was even one of your own people, along with who knows how many other worthless humans." Smirking cruelly, he paused for a moment, then added, "Knowing how weak you are, you should be glad to be rid of him. Even a low-level such as he is, a threat to your pathetic life." "Goku didn't mean to hurt his grandpa. He didn't know what he was doing. He's the sweetest, gentlest, kindest person I know, and probably smarter than you too." She really did like Goku, but the facts were that he had been relatively uneducated until he met up with her. So saying that Vegeta was dumber than Goku, a so-called third class, was a tremendous insult. But she didn't stop there. "And I don't know about Saiyajin no Uji," she mocked scathingly, putting her forefinger under his chin in a manner usually reserved for dealing with small children. "Chibi no Uji is more like it." Unknown to Bulma, something within Vegeta snapped and his kie began to spike upwards. A vein on his temple throbbed visibly, his eye twitching involuntarily, and his fists clenched and unclenched while his whole body shook with rage. Cocking one of his fists back, energy flaring around his hand, he snarled wordlessly as he prepared to incinerate the creature that dared to insult him in such a manner. Crack! Before Vegeta had time to even register what had happened, Trunks had phased in between the quarreling duo and backhanded the young prince with enough power to send the black-haired boy crashing into the wall. The whole capsule house shuddered from the force of the impact. The wall itself cracked and dented where Vegeta had slammed into it. He slid down the wall to a position that was half-sitting, half-leaning, blinking in an attempt to clear the stars from his vision. Blood trickled from the Saiyan's nose and into his mouth as the boy stared at the lavender-haired Demi-Saiyan dazedly. Tasting the blood on his lips, Vegeta raised a shaky hand to his nose, then brought it back far enough to blink in shocked disbelief at the moist redness that covered his fingers. His gaze flickered back to Trunks, this time fully registering the murderous look on his future son's face. "I thought I had made it clear, father," Trunks stated in a voice so calm and venomous that Vegeta shivered involuntarily. "You will not attack anyone who is not a threat." Stalking forward until he was right in front of the fallen prince, he stared down angrily and added, "Threats to your pride do not count." Not waiting to hear if Vegeta would say anything in response, Trunks growled in disgust and turned his back on the older boy. He knew that if he remained in close proximity to his father's past self, he might do something even worse. He too was furious with Vegeta for being so cold and cruel to the young Goku, but he also knew that beating the Saiyan prince to a bloody pulp would not help matters any. Instead, he stalked off to one of the several bedrooms and threw himself into a bed, not bothering to undress. He didn't expect to get any sleep yet, but he hoped that being separated from the source of his anger would help him calm down. Meanwhile, Bulma was also in shock as she blinked in surprise at Vegeta, who was only now picking himself up off the floor. "Father?" she echoed, incredulously. "Vegeta is his father? But they're nothing alike. How could he be Trunks' father?" Unbidden, a vision of the 9-year-old's face appeared in her mind as he had glared furiously at Vegeta. And Bulma could suddenly see the resemblance, the sharp features, the regally arched eyebrows, the way their mouths were shaped when they were angry. A million small details instantly clear to hindsight, all indicating that a blood relationship between the two did indeed exist. Even with this proof, though, the girl's mind had difficulty grasping the revelation. Vegeta is Trunks' father? Even though the confrontation had ended, the air was still thick with tension. Uncomfortable with the atmosphere, Goten glanced longingly at the broken door and the stormy world outside. However, before he could even take one step, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Turning his face up towards the person holding him back, he found his Uncle Raditz shaking his head. "Your grandfather doesn't need any help," the 15-year-old boy stated reluctantly, as though he too wanted nothing more than to join his father in the search for his little brother. "If he can't find Goku, I doubt either of us could. We would only get in his way and distract him." Watching his nephew swallow a lump in his throat, tears threatening to form in his eyes, Raditz uncomfortably concluded that it was his job to do something to take the boy's mind away from the situation. Awkwardly picking up the boy, who looked so much like his brother, the older Saiyan said, "It's getting late, I'll take you to your bed." The storm was still raging at its fullest when Bardock stood up stiffly, his muscles protesting against moving after being still for 2 solid minutes in the cold, cramp-inducing rain. He ignored the complaints of his body, grimly setting his jaw as he once again began to search for his missing son. This time, he did not run. If the reason he could not sense Goku's ki was that the boy was injured, he would be more likely to miss him or any signs he might have left of his passage by running through the woods, haphazardly. Instead, he walked, casting his eyes and his senses in all directions, attempting to pierce the gloom that the combined might of the storm and nighttime created. Lightning flared across the sky, momentarily highlighting everything in harsh blue tones before fading away. Moments later, a crash of thunder rumbled in the distance, vibrating in Bardock's sensitive ears. Bardock ignored both the lightning and the thunder as he plodded stoically through the mud and underbrush, every sense in his body straining to its limits. Goku was out there somewhere, he knew. It was only a matter of finding him. Another flash illuminated the night, followed closely by another resounding crack that sounded more like a giant boulder breaking under the strain of some angry god's hammer. For some reason, the thunder just kept on going, thrumming in his ears, rushing, roaring, almost deafening him. Then he realized, his confusion causing him to pause in his search, that it wasn't thunder. The air itself, while being whipped by the constant rain, was not shivering the way it did when thunder rolled through. What? If there's no thunder, then what am I hearing? A wave of dizziness overtook him, and he reached out to put a hand on the bald of a large tree to steady himself. However, instead of meeting rough bark, his fingers passed through the trunk of the tree, and he lost his balance. Stumbling, he managed to catch himself before he fell, turning around as he did so to glare in puzzlement at the insubstantial tree. "What the hell?" he muttered, passing his hand through the tree once more to be sure that it hadn't just been his imagination. No such luck. The tree remained firmly in place, and definitely intangible. All at once, the tree disappeared, leaving no trace that it had ever existed in the first place. Bardock stared at the spot where it had been moments before, then slowly shook his head. "I'm imagining things," he stated firmly, swiftly turning his back on the place where the phantom tree once stood. Putting the incident firmly out of his mind, the warrior began his search again with renewed vigor. He didn't care how long he was out here or how cold, wet, or miserable it was in this forest. He would not rest until he had found Goku. If anything, the discomfort he was feeling only proved to strengthen his resolve to locate his son as quickly as possible, knowing that the boy was also suffering the same weather conditions he was. A hardened warrior like himself could withstand such things, but Bardock doubted that Goku had undergone the same training he had, or experienced the same things that allowed him to continue on, oblivious to the raging elements. No, if Goku didn't have some form of shelter over his head, or, worse yet, if he was injured and lying somewhere exposed to these harsh conditions, there was a good chance that the 7-year-old's health would suffer severely, and the longer it took Bardock to find him, the longer he would have to endure the icy storm. It was with great surprise that he found himself once again facing the phantom tree, almost as if the thing had popped up in his path out of thin air. He could tell it was the same tree because it was taller than most of the trees in the forest, and because it had a distinctive shape to its top, 3 separate lobes like a 3-leaf clover or a club. Frowning, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. On the ground next to the tree was a 4th lobe, split off from the main trunk as though cloven by a colossal axe. Almost hesitantly, Bardock reached out towards the tree to see if it was real. Right before his hand would have met the trunk, the mysterious tree disappeared again. A scowl furrowed Bardock's brow, and he cursed fluently. "What the hell is going on here?" he fumed, glaring at the rain-slicked grass that had been beneath the crushing weight of the fallen limb. Not surprisingly, nothing answered his question except the howl of the winds. With an increasing feeling of frustration, the tall Saiyan took a firm step forward, determined to continue the search for his missing son. At least that's what he tried to do. Instead, his foot faltered as another wave of dizziness struck him, accompanied by a sharp pain in his head that drove him to his knees, clutching his head between his hands. He grimaced as the pain and nausea threatened to topple him, then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Blinking furiously, his eyes focused, and again he was staring head-on at the now familiar tree. This time, though, he did not question what was going on. He knew. Oh, calm him. He knew. "No, not again," he shouted desperately, swiping his hands across his eyes in an attempt to clear his vision of water and of the sight of the tree. "I thought the visions were gone. For good," he protested inwardly as he saw that the tree remained where it was, its branches bending against the wind, proving without the need for physical contact that this tree was also a ghost, a figment of the curse of foresight that Bardock suffered. Almost against his will, Bardock's eyes were drawn to the fallen limb. A thing almost as big around as the Saiyajin was at the waist. Branches and limbs had splintered off the main piece in every direction, making it hard to see what lay beneath. But he somehow knew exactly where to look, almost as if he already knew. There, beneath one of the larger parts of the phantom tree limb, was what his contracting heart had known all along. He would find, mind numb with the glimpse he had caught. Bardock stumbled forward a few steps until he had a clear view of focus of the vision. All feeling left him and he stopped breathing, his throat squeezing so tight it hurt. His eyes widened and pupils dilated in shock and denial of what he saw. Broken, bloody, and lifeless, the body of Son Goku lay pinned by the bowl of the branch, a long splinter jabbing clear through his side and out his back, blood mingling with the icy rain to become a diluted pink that stained the boy's pale, bloodless skin. The bones of one of his legs had snapped, parts of the bone sticking out through the ragged flesh and torn material of the blue gi that had once belonged to Goten. His face was slack, motionless, and frozen in an expression of agony and turmoil, both mental and physical. Bardock's gut wrenched within him as he realized that Goku was not moving. At first he passed it off as part of the vision that maybe the whole scene was a frozen moment of time, but then he saw the branches of the tree quiver in the wind and he knew that it was too late, that his youngest son had ceased to move because he could no longer draw breath. "No," he whispered disbelievingly, and yet knowing that the vision was true. The visions had always been accurate, except for the one time when his grandson from the future had stepped in. Even after the vision disappeared again, Bardock kept seeing the body of his youngest son, helplessly crushed by the limb of a tree with 3 remaining lobes. Sinking to his knees, he buried his fingers in the mud and grass where the ghost of Goku's corpse had been a bare second ago, a choked sob escaping his lips. "No!" Gathering breath for another throat-wrenching cry, Bardock screamed until his lungs burned for air, then launched himself into the tempestuous night, aura blazing around him as hotly as the grief within him burned, knowing from the vision what to look for in order to find his son's body. No! Lightning slashed through the pitch-black clouds, turning the sky an angry, bruised purple for a few brief seconds. The ensuing thunder crashed into the air with the sheer force of a tidal wave, threatening to crack the very world with its power. As though that had been a signal, the ferocity of the storm intensified until the rain sliced through the air like frozen daggers that attempted to thrash everything they touched to shreds, then leave what was left to drown miserably in an icy puddle. Oblivious to the freezing rain, Bardock realized he had a major problem barring him in his search. It was too dark to see the shapes of the treetops clearly enough to be able to distinguish one tree from another. Refusing to allow such a thing as the dark to hinder him in finding his son, the warrior held his hand up in the air and gathered his ki in it, shoving everything he had into the glowing yellow ball until it burned with the intensity of the sun. Not good enough. While the light it provided was enough to reveal the landscape around him for a fair distance, the ki ball's light did not extend nearly as far as he would need. Hot, salty tears poured down his face, mingling with the rain that drenched him, and he focused on his pain and sorrow, drawing energy from the strength of his grief. Giving an anguished scream as he envisioned the broken form of his son, Bardock felt his ki ball spike higher and higher, searing his body as it pulsed up into his raised hand, until finally the sphere was so bright that it illuminated the world around him almost as far as he could see. The air around him began to steam as the rain that came too close to the intense heat of Bardock's ki evaporated before it could even come in contact with him. Satisfied, the Saiyan stared down into the forest below, drifting through the air as quickly as he dared and still be sure that he had examined every tree. The strain of having to hold such a huge amount of energy taxed his body, sweat dripping from every pore from both the heat and the stress of constantly siphoning his ki to power the miniature Nova. None of that mattered to him, though. All that he cared about was reaching his son before his terrible vision had a chance to come true. Another memory slid across his mind. A memory of another storm and another desperate search. This is just like it was with Sareri. Bardock shuddered, tears flowing freshly down his cheeks, remembering how that search had ended. "I promise you, Goku, I won't let it end like that." "Not this time. I'll find you, I swear it." Swallowing a painful lump in his throat, he added, "I won't let you die." Something at the edge of the light shed by his Kiki orb caught his attention. A faint outline of a tree that rose above the others, and an ominous sense of foreboding suddenly prickled his skin. With his stomach twisting in knots, the Saiyan blasted through the cloudy sky, leaving a blazing trail in his wake. His heart pounded wildly in his ears, drowning out the distant thunder, and it felt like a wild animal was trapped within his gut, scrabbling frantically to get free. Hope fluttered in the back of his mind like a wounded bird as he drew near enough to be able to count the lobes of the tree. 3. 3 lobes in a clover shape. And a 4th. A fallen branch that could almost have qualified as a fully grown tree in its own right, splintered away from its parent by the force of the storm. Bardock gave a strangled cry and dropped from the sky like a stone, releasing the built-up energy of the ki ball as he did so. "That's the tree I saw in my vision, and if the branch is already on the ground, it means that... No, Joku!" His feet had barely touched the ground before he was sprinting forward, desperately shoving aside the broken and splintered branches that lay in his path, until he caught sight of what he had prayed he would not see. His son. Just as he had seen in his vision, Goku lay sprawled out on the ground, barely visible beneath the massive branch that had fallen across his chest, almost crushing it with its weight. A piece of the limb had broken away and now impaled the child, angling into his side just below his ribs and all the way through until it emerged from his back. One leg was badly mangled, broken, and twisted in a way that was far from natural and had to have hurt like hell when it had been snapped. Blood was everywhere, watered down by the rain, which had abated somewhat until it was nothing more than a depressing, bone-chilling drizzle. It stained everything near the boy with shades of red and pink that slowly faded as the rain continued to mix with it. "No," Bardock whispered hoarsely, collapsing to his knees next to the motionless form of his youngest son. He reached a trembling hand out to caress the boy's bloodless, clammy cheek, and was suddenly racked by shuddering sobs. No, there was no warmth, no life in Goku's pain-contorted face. He was too late. "No," he moaned, using a carefully controlled ki blast to incinerate the branch where it had pinned his son to the ground. Tears spilled from his stinging eyes like a salty river, nearly blinding him as he gently pulled the wooden stake from the ragged, gaping wound in the boy's side. Tossing the bloodied object to one side, he tenderly gathered his son's limp, broken body in his arms, rocking him back and forth as grief overtook him. "No," he sobbed, bowing his head and clutching Goku's cold, battered form to his chest, and burying his face in the boy's spiky, matted hair. Once again he had been too late, and now he had lost his precious son. He would never hear his carefree laughter, would never see his innocent smile, would never feel his warm arms encircle his neck. None of those things would ever happen again, and it was all his fault. His fault for being too slow. His fault for not stopping Vegeta before the prince could reveal the harsh truth of Gohan's death. His fault for abandoning Goku in the first place. He had failed his son just as he had failed his mate 7 years ago. As Bardock cried into his son's hair, his tears soaking the midnight strands, the heavens continued to openly weep with him, the pace of the rain picking up once more to a steady downpour, ensuring that he remained thoroughly drenched, leaching all the warmth from his body. He didn't care, his son was dead. Compared to that, nothing in the entire universe mattered anymore. "Goku, my son," he choked out, feeling as though his heart was about to break like spun glass that had been carelessly knocked off a shelf, and like that figurative, shattered glass. He knew that there would be no way to mend his broken heart. "My son." Oblivious to the rain, Bardock trudged dispiritedly back towards the capsule house, still cradling Goku against his chest, the blood from his son's wound staining his pink shirt crimson. Bardock didn't even notice, nor would he have cared if he had. His mind was numb, his grief having washed away all form of conscious thought. Tired, cold, wet, miserable, and feeling pretty hopeless. All he wanted was to go home, collapse in a warm, dry bed, and grieve for his lost son. He could worry about everything else later. In fact, he was paying so little attention to the world around him that he didn't even notice when Goku's 7-year-old hand twitched and curled around a fistful of Bardock's shirt. Nor did he notice when his son's head shifted ever so slightly to rest more easily against his father's broad chest. Goku's eyes flickered open sleepily, taking a few moments to be able to focus properly. "Oko-san?" he whispered faintly, barely audible even to Saiyajin ears. Drained by the effort to say even that much, his eyes slid shut again. Bardock jerked to a halt in mid-stride, nearly tripping over his own feet, as stunned disbelief nearly shorted out his nervous system. His son, his dead son, he was talking. His eyes widened in shock and, unconsciously, his mouth dropped open. However, his vocal cords had constricted painfully to the point of uselessness, and nothing came out except his own ragged breathing. Closing his mouth, all he could do was stare in dazed amazement at the child he held in his arms. To his surprise, he found that he was crying again. He had thought that he had no more tears with which to cry, but apparently he was wrong. This time, though, the tears were ones of joy, trailing down his cheeks to collect in the corners of his broad grin. His heart felt like it had stopped beating, swelling to twice its normal size, and he had to concentrate just to keep breathing. Letting out a wild whoop, he twirled around gleefully, then leapt at the air and blasted off, eager to get back to the capsule house where he could tend his son's wounds. It was probably a very shocking sight to behold when Bardock raced into the house, sopping wet, covered in blood, holding a half-dead and even bloodier Goku in his arms, and grinning madly the entire time. Bulma and Raditz, the only two who were still awake, openly gaped at him. They had decided to wait as long as they could for Bardock to get back and had been contemplating giving up for the night. When the Saiyan in question ran through the entrance, since the door had been beyond repair, it had been propped up against the wall and out of the way. Judging by how recklessly Bardock had entered, that was probably a good thing, since it would most likely have been damaged even further if they had tried to put it back into its original place. "He's alive," Bardock announced happily as he stood in the middle of the room, a large puddle of water forming beneath his feet. Oblivious to the stares he was getting from the two children, he walked over to the table and gently laid his son on the surface, stripping the boy's blue jian off. "However," he continued, turning completely serious as he surveyed the extent of the damage, "he's pretty badly injured. I need you two to help me get him cleaned up. Bulma, find whatever it is you Chiakyujin use to clean and bind wounds. Raditz, I need you to pin Goku down while I snap those broken bones back in place." Involuntarily glancing at the mangled leg that Bardock indicated, Bulma paled, feeling as though she was going to be sick. She quickly looked away and hurried off to get the bandages and antiseptic from the first aid kit, assuming it would be in the bathroom where such things were normally kept. Waiting until Raditz had firmly trapped his little brother with his arms, Bardock studied the bones in Goku's leg again, judging what angle and how much pressure would be needed to force them back into their correct position. It was a sobering sight, to say the least. When he cleaned the wound, he would have to be careful to get all of the mud out, and there were a few bone splinters that would have to be removed before the wound could be bandaged. Glancing around, he plucked a thin pillow from one of the couches and placed it between Goku's teeth. "Okay, I'm ready," he said to Raditz and himself. Raditz pressed down on the boy's shoulders hard enough to keep them in place, careful not to injure him further. Bardock counted to 3 silently, grasping the 2 parts of his son's broken leg, then swiftly twisted his hands and snapped the bones back into place. A heart-rending scream pierced the air as the sudden pain jolted Goku into momentary consciousness, thrashing futilely against his older brother's grip. If Bardock and Raditz had not both been there to hold down both his upper and lower body, his struggles might have done even more damage to the gaping hole in his side, not to mention his broken and as yet unbound leg. Once the initial shock wore off, though, the boy collapsed and fell back into unconsciousness, breathing heavily and occasionally whimpering. Bulma returned, medical supplies in hand, looking shaken after listening to her young friends screaming, as she placed the items on the table next to the wounded chibi and went to fill a bowl of water in the sink. Rodit settled onto the couch and watched, knowing that he would be of no use at this point since he had no nursing skills whatsoever. Grabbing a clean rag from the pile of supplies, Bulma began to wipe away the blood and mud, explaining the uses of the various creams, cleansers, and antibiotics she had brought. She bit her lip as she came across the hole in Goku's side, feeling tears pricking at the corners of her eyes in sympathetic pain. "What happened?" she asked, momentarily looking away from her work in order to catch Bardock's black eyes with her own. "A tree limb fell on him," he explained, shaking his head slightly before hunching over Goku's leg again. Using a pair of tweezers, he deftly removed another bone shard and laid it to one side in a small pile of debris that had been pulled from the injury. "I didn't get to him until after it had happened, so I don't know any more than that." Satisfied that he had removed any and all foreign objects and bone slivers from his son's leg, he set aside the tweezers and grabbed a bottle of alcohol from the kit. Figuring the best thing to do was to thoroughly douse the wound, he opened the bottle and upended half the contents onto the raw, broken flesh, eliciting another whimper from the sleeping Goku. He once again examined the leg, then nodded to himself. He had done the best he could do with the materials provided, so all that was left was splinting and binding the injured leg. Fortunately, the first aid kit happened to have a splint that would work for Goku's little leg. Once he had finished wrapping and splinting the leg, Bardock glanced over at Bulma's progress and found that she was nearly done placing the bandages over both the entrance and exit wounds caused by the splintered branch. He nodded his approval and set about wiping down the rest of his son's body, cleaning minor scratches and generally removing the dirt, twigs, and leaves from his skin. By the time he had finished this task, Bulma had completed her work as well and was now sitting back in a chair, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. The Saiyajin caught her attention and gave her a grateful look before he gathered his naked son into his arms. "I'm going to take him to his room," he said. Goku would need to be kept warm, and he would probably end up sleeping for several days before he was recovered to any real extent of the word. "I'll clean up here," Bulma offered, gesturing to indicate the entire room. So you can stay with him. Giving the girl a fleeting smile, Bardock turned and left the room. Walking down the halls, he suddenly wondered where the other three boys were. He had thought Goku's screams had been loud enough to wake the dead, let alone the living. Maybe the walls of this building are soundproofed. He shook his head, knowing he would find no answers this night. Right now, he needed to get his son into a bed, and then get some sleep himself. There would be time enough for curiosity when morning came. Walking into a vacant bedroom, he laid his sleeping son on the bed and pulled the covers over his small, bare body. A tiny smile crept across his face, sighing with relief now that the crisis was over, and he ruffled the child's hair affectionately, careful not to wake him. He collapsed into a chair next to the bed and watched the steady rise and fall of the chibi Saiyan's chest until an exhausted sleep overtook him. The morning sun had already risen halfway through the sky, burning away the last vestiges of the clouds that remained after the storm of the previous night before Bardock began to stir. Not that he was ready to be awake, of course, but the brilliant sunshine that filtered in through the room's sole window fell directly on his face, convincing him that if he wanted to sleep any longer, he would have to move to another location or suffer the consequences. He cracked his eyes open just wide enough to survey the room in search of a shadier location where he could still keep an eye on his sleeping son, and was surprised to find that he was not alone. Standing next to the bed was the young prince, Vegeta, sunlight glinting off his flame-shaped black hair, giving him faint brown highlights. Vegeta apparently was not aware that Bardock was awake, as all he did was stare at the sleeping Goku with an odd expression on his face. Feigning unconsciousness, Bardock frowned internally, trying to interpret what he was seeing on the 10-year-old boy's face. It certainly wasn't what he was expecting from the arrogant, insensitive brat who had broken Goku's heart the night before with his callousness. Nor was it something he would have matched with the mischievous boy who had helped Goten and Trunks play pranks on him during the trip to Earth. In fact, it would have been out of place even for the child who had run away, however temporarily, from the kingship of his people. Was it remorse? Regret? Concern? If Bardock had previously had any thoughts of anger towards the prince because of his behavior last night, the look on Vegeta's face caused him to forget them. Instead, all he felt was an itching curiosity to know why Vegeta had that look on his face. Opening his eyes completely, he asked in a carefully neutral voice, "Vegeta?" Vegeta nearly jumped out of his skin in surprise, whirling around to face the older Saiyan as though he'd been caught in the act of doing something unforgivable. His face became a blank mask. All trace of his earlier emotions completely wiped off as though they had never been, and he glared almost threateningly at Bardock, silently daring him to say something about what he had just witnessed. "What?" he growled angrily. Their gazes locked, each searching the other's eyes for some hint of what the other was thinking, and Bardock took a deep breath before asking, point blank, "What are you doing here, Vegeta?" The prince's shoulders stiffened at the question, and the older warrior could tell from the way that Vegeta's jaw muscles clenched that he was undergoing some internal conflict of some kind. Breaking eye contact, Vegeta stared moodily at some point beyond Bardock's shoulder. "As the Prince of all Saiyans, it is my job to be aware of the condition of my subjects," he responded woodenly, jutting his chin out, defiantly. "I was merely examining your Baka-san to see if he would be a hindrance in completing this silly quest." Their eyes met again, and Bardock was surprised to find that he didn't believe a word of what Vegeta had said. "Why did you tell him the truth about his grandfather's death?" Bardock asked softly, his eyes narrowing slightly. The spark of anger rekindled itself in his heart as he remembered just how insensitive and cruel the boy before him had been. The night before, as well as all the trouble and pain his words had caused, his son had nearly died last night, and all because of this Sakyajin boy who stood before him. The strange look Bardock had noted earlier flickered momentarily in Vegeta's eyes before quickly being squashed. What was it? Shame? Sorrow? Surely not. Vegeta snapped his head to one side, glaring down at Goku as he tried to sort through his mind to come up with the answer to Bardock's question without meeting the other Saiyan's soul-searching gaze. "We all do things we shouldn't," he said at last, a cryptic tone to his words, "and it is up to us to take responsibility for what we have done." With that, the 10-year-old Saiyajin Nouji padded out of the room, not looking back at either of the two occupants. Bardock stared at the boy's receding form, a thoughtful and somewhat surprised look on his face. Surprised because of the remarkable insight Vegeta had shown for his age. Thoughtfulness because Who was Vegeta really talking about? Bardock was still deep in thought, trying to unravel the mystery of Vegeta's words, when Bulma, Goten, and Trunks walked into the room. Looking up from his contemplation, the warrior watched as Goten and Trunks levitated up far enough to get a clear look at Goku, grateful that the blanket covering Goku was thick and dark enough to hide the blood that had no doubt soaked through his son's bandages and probably into the sheets. The two boys didn't need to be any more alarmed than they no doubt already were. Bulma smiled and brushed a lock of the Chibi Saiyan's hair out of his face, then looked back up at Bardock. "How is he?" the human girl asked. On cue, Goten chirped, "Is he gonna be okay?" "Grandpa." Trunks didn't say anything, but he also gave the older warrior a worried look. "He'll be okay," Bardock assured them as he stood up, stretching muscles that had cramped up from a night of sleeping in a chair. In doing so, he noticed that the pink shirt he was still wearing had stiffened from dried mud and blood, as had his tattered black pants. He frowned down at his clothing. "I really need to get some new clothes," he muttered to himself as he pulled the soiled shirt off, not really aware he was speaking out loud. Bulma's eyes lit up at these words, and she began to stare at Bardock critically as though she were measuring him in her mind. "Clothes, huh?" she said, a broad grin spreading across her face. "Well, I happen to know for a fact that there's a city nearby, Orange Star City to be precise, and they have loads of malls and department stores. It'd be no problem at all to find some new clothes for you. And since I just happen to be the daughter of one of the richest men in the world, money won't be a problem for you either. Since you're not exactly from Earth, I seriously doubt you have any of the local currency on you. Here, give me that," she said, snatching the once pink shirt from his hands. "I'll need this so I can get an idea of what size you are." After, of course, she added, wrinkling her nose in disgust, "I get this cleaned. It's absolutely filthy. So, are you for that matter. You really should take a bath." Off to the side, Trunks began to snigger as he watched his mom enter into her bossy mode, feeling a twinge of sympathy for the poor sane man who had no idea what he was about to get himself into. No matter what age she was, it looked like the blue-haired scientist took delight in ruling the lives of males of all species. It was all the lilac-haired boy could do to keep from rolling on the floor laughing as Bulma grabbed Bardock's hand and dragged him off to the bathroom, assuring him that she, Trunks, and Goten would keep an eye on Goku while he cleaned up. Meanwhile, she would do what she could to salvage his clothing so that he would be as presentable as possible when they went shopping in Orange Star City. Admittedly, that probably wouldn't be up to Bulma's standards, but Bardock couldn't help the fact that he had only one set of clothing. Well, she would soon remedy that little detail. "You know," she said thoughtfully to herself as she took Bardock's shirt and pants off to the laundry machine, "I've noticed that Radats doesn't have any other clothes, too." With a cheerful smile on her face, the human girl tossed the clothes into a washer and added some soap that had been designed by a branch of Capsule Corp, specifically to deal with stains of all kinds. It was something she never left home without because she never knew when she might need to salvage a particular outfit at any given time. "I guess that means I'll have to take him shopping with Bardock and me." Giving a delighted laugh, Bulma sauntered off to find her crush and inform him of his impending journey. "Hey, Trunks." Goten hopped up into the chair that his grandfather had just vacated, swinging his legs over the edge as he looked at his best friend. He self-consciously tugged at the orange gauze his chibi father had given him, something that had become a permanent trade after the first day. Thinking of Goku, Goten glanced back at the sleeping boy in concern. "Yeah, Goten?" Trunks was sitting cross-legged on the end of the bed, his chin resting in the palm of one hand as he, too, stared at the 7-year-old. Goku slept on, oblivious to the conversations that had been going on in the same room all morning. He didn't appear to be in any pain, but Goten's sensitive ears picked up a faint whimper every now and again, especially audible now that there was less noise being made. "I'm worried," the spiky black-haired chibi stated. "About Goku, I mean. For some reason, it seemed awkward to call Goku Dad when he was even younger than Goten was. I asked Bulma how bad he got hurt, and she wouldn't say. Whenever someone doesn't want to tell us bad news, they always try to hide it." "I know what you mean," the purple-haired boy snorted. "They say it's because they don't want to scare us, but they don't seem to realize that not knowing is worse than knowing. Imagination makes things 10 times worse." With a sigh, the older Demi-Saiyan moved his chin to rest on his other hand. "Trunks, what if Goku's dying?" Goten asked in sudden alarm. "What if there's something really wrong with him, and that's why Bulma wouldn't tell us what happened?" Leaping to his feet in an agitated manner, The boy floated over to peer at the unconscious occupant of the bed in search of any sign that his guess might be accurate. Before Trunks could protest, Goten had pulled back the sheets and quilt covering his look-alike to completely reveal Goku's unclothed form. Both boys gasped in shock as they took in the blood-stained condition of the sheets and bandages. Tears pricked at the corners of Goten's eyes, which he furiously scrubbed away with the back of his hand as he knelt down on top of the bed next to his father's past self. "Trunks, I was right. He's bleeding and he's gonna die. I don't want him to die, Trunks." Goten pulled his wounded friend into a protective hug and cried, nearly hysterical with grief at the thought of losing Goku. Realizing that his friend might be right, Trunks gnawed his lower lip worriedly. "If only we had a Sanzu bean," he muttered, fingering the interior of his pockets where he had once had 2 of the precious beans. Unfortunately, both beans had been used long ago, one to save Bardock's life and one to heal Goten after his fight with King Cold. Then it dawned on him. "That's it, Goten. We can go to Karin's tower and get some more Sanzu beans. Then Goku won't die after all." Suddenly, his stomach started grumbling loudly, and he added sheepishly, "But let's wait until after breakfast, okay?" Goten brightened at the prospect of being able to do something to save Goku's life. His own belly grumbled a complaint, and he nodded in agreement with Trunks' plan. "Right, after breakfast, we can go get some Senzu beans." Together, the 2 boys raced out of the room, leaving Goku alone. In their excitement, the 2 had accidentally forgotten to pull the covers back up over the naked, injured child, and Goku shivered, though he did not wake up. By the time Goten and Trunks got to the kitchen, Bulma, Raditz, Vegeta, and Bardock were all seated around the table, finishing up their meal at their own respective paces. Bardock grinned at their plaintive faces and tossed a food capsule to the older of the 2 boys. Catching it easily, Trunks quickly popped it open, and he and his black-haired counterpart eagerly attacked the meal. "Bulma and Raditz and I are going to go to a city to get some clothes," Bardock said. Indicating his freshly washed but still tattered clothing, he added, "It'd be nice to have something besides this pink shirt of yours, Trunks." An amused smile crossed his face as he saw Vegeta's disgusted look at the mention of the shirt. After all, the shirt actually belonged to his future self, much to his chagrin. "You know, funny thing about that shirt," Bulma commented as she rooted through her purse, making sure she had everything she'd need for the shopping trip. "I think my dad has one just like it in his closet. Identical, right down to the Beatty 80 man on the back. I always loved that shirt. Too bad he never wears it anymore. Maybe he'll give it to me, and when I have a husband, he can wear it." A small smile played on Bulma's lips as she envisioned Raditz in the pink Beatty 80 man shirt. He'd look really cute in that shirt. Hearing Bulma talk about the pink shirt, Bardock glanced at her nervously to see if she had realized that the shirts weren't just identical, they were the same. That is, if he was correct in his assumption that Bulma and Vegeta were the eventual parents of Trunks, which he didn't doubt for a minute that he was. Too many coincidences, and too many similarities pointed accusing fingers that all agreed with the idea, however odd and disturbing it might be, that the human girl and the prince of the Saiyan race would one day become close enough to each other to at least have a child. Bardock noticed that Trunks and Vegeta were also trying not to react to Bulma's words about the infamous pink shirt. Vegeta suddenly frowned as he noticed the odd coincidence of Bulma owning a shirt exactly like the one his future mate was supposed to own. But the 10-year-old's mind never even came close to considering the true connotations that Bulma owning a pink Beidie man shirt might imply. It was never a possibility in the Saiyajin no Uji's mind that this might be more than mere coincidence. After all, if he acknowledged that it might not be coincidence, he'd have to deal with the idea of mating with the blue-haired witch. That was simply an impossibility. With a hastily suppressed chuckle, Bardock turned back to Goten and Trunks. "Anyway, we'll be leaving you 2 and Vegeta here to look after Goku while we're gone. Meaning, we're leaving you 2 to look after both Vegeta and Goku. If anything goes wrong, flare your ki to battle levels and we'll come back as quickly as we can." Both boys nodded their comprehension of the instructions, though they had only listened with half an ear, their minds concentrating on their own little errand. "Good luck," Trunks cheerfully wished the 2 Sakians as they rose into the air after Bulma's car. He smirked. "You'll need it." Oh yes, would they need it? Shopping with Bulma was not a task to be undertaken lightly, under any circumstances. Something that Goten and Trunks had conveniently forgotten to mention to either Bardock or Raditz before they left. As soon as the trio was out of sight, Goten and Trunks grabbed a dragon radar. "Hey, they never knew if there would be a Dragon Ball on the way. and blasted off into the sky at top speed, completely forgetting that they were leaving Vegeta to watch over Goku on his own. At first, Vegeta was not aware that he had been left on his own inside the capsule house. He had not felt it worth his time to see the trio of shoppers off, so he had remained within the building, sprawled out on the couch as he thought about what he would do while the others were gone. Maybe he could convince his future son to spar with him, perhaps teach him new techniques. After all, Trunks was probably the strongest, so if he, Vegeta, wanted to become the strongest fighter in the universe, what better way than to have the purple-haired Demi-Saiyan train him? The only problem that he could see was that Trunks might still be angry with him for the incident last night, but since no permanent harm was done to Kakarot, and I didn't actually do anything to the girl, Trunks won't stay mad at me for long. In his mind, Goku would always be Kakarot, no matter what his friends and family called him, because he was a Saiyajin and Kakarot was his Saiyajin name. Even though Goku was only a pathetic low-class child, he was still Saiyan, and as such, deserved better than to be called by an alien name. Well, nothing to do but wait and see. And so Vegeta waited for Trunks and Goten to come back inside. And waited. And waited. With a growl of impatience, the 10-year-old Saiyan jumped up off the couch and stormed outside to see what the hell was taking those two so long. He stalked through the door and opened his mouth to shout something, but shut it again when he realized there was no one in sight. Huh? Where did they go? Tentatively reaching out with his key senses, he searched for the two younger boys in an ever-broadening area centering on the capsule house. That's odd. I can't find them. They're either hiding their power, or they're far enough away that they're not in my range. Giving one last attempt to locate either of the two boys from the future, Vegeta stretched his senses as far as they would go until he began to sweat from the strain. His efforts paid off when he felt a familiar flicker of ki just at the edge of his range that seemed to be remaining stationary for now. After a minute, the flicker disappeared as Trunks, for that was who the ki signature belonged to, moved again too far for Vegeta to track. Kuso! Vegeta swore with feeling. Those two brats have left me here alone. They didn't even tell me they were going somewhere, much less where. His face darkening in anger, the young prince stalked back inside the house, furious at being ignored or forgotten. Not knowing what exactly to do with himself, he stomped around the house aimlessly until he passed by the room where Goku was sleeping. For lack of something better to do, he walked in and glowered down at the bloody child. And I suppose they're expecting me to look after you, he growled in annoyance. Me, the prince of all Saiyans, playing nursemaid to a third-class baka. Someone had failed to pull the covers back up over the boy's injured form, but he callously chose to ignore that, since it wasn't his doing, and since it would only be encouraging weakness in Goku. If Kakarot can't handle a little cold, he is no Saiyajin. Despite how much he protested the fact that he had been left in charge of Goku's care, Vegeta sat down in the chair and glared at the sleeping boy. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that he felt the need to rant at someone, and Goku was the only one present, even if he was unconscious. Look at you. It's disgusting that even a third class like you could be injured by a falling tree branch. What were you doing suppressing your ki to the point that you had no defenses left? Idiot! Sighing moodily, he quit talking for a long time, simply raking his eyes over Goku's battered body critically, noting every scratch and bruise, every drop of blood on his pale skin, every ounce of muscle and baby fat. After a while, he spoke up again, most of the ire drained from his voice, replaced instead by an odd emotion even he couldn't identify. For a 7-year-old third class who's been raised by a bunch of pathetic weaklings, you really haven't done that badly. You and your brother weren't aware of it, but I watched your little spar. You're both so far below me, it's ridiculous. But if you think of it in terms of the classes, your brother could almost qualify to be a first-class soldier, and given proper training and time, you could be rather strong yourself, perhaps even a worthy sparring partner. Allowing his mind to travel to that theoretical future, the prince smirked contemptuously and stood up. Except for the fact that you obviously have brain damage. No matter how strong you ever become, your spirit is too weak to be Saiyajin. Vegeta stepped towards the bed and stared down at the chibi, who continued to be oblivious to his prince's presence. Of course you'll never be able to beat me, I am. After all, the Saiyajin no Uji, he said softly. Noting how Goku was shivering in his sleep from cold or blood loss, Vegeta couldn't tell. But I am curious to see how far you could go if you had someone to teach you. Perhaps I will take you back with me to Vegeta-sei and give you over to one of the royal trainers. Who knows? Maybe they could even awaken some of your Saiyajin instinct. Make you a warrior I'd be proud to have at my side. The vague, unknown feeling returned, and the 10-year-old suddenly found himself reaching out to tug the covers back up over Goku's naked body. He told himself it was because he didn't want to deal with accusations from his future son or the irritating voice of the Ana. Should they decide that he had purposefully neglected the brat? Pulling his hands back to his sides, his face became unreadable. And if you ever tell a single soul a word I have said, he added menacingly, even though he knew Goku had been completely unconscious the entire time, I will make you wish that you had never been born. Despite how much time had passed during his monologue, neither Goten and Trunks nor Bardock, Raditz, and Bulma had returned. Grumbling his displeasure at his continued babysitting, Vegeta sat back down into the chair and prepared himself for what looked to be a long wait. Goten, hurry it up already, Trunks shouted angrily at his friend. We don't have all day. I'm sorry, Trunks. I'm going as fast as I can. Goten whined from his position in front of a cliff. A continuous tinkling sound filled the air as a stream of sparkling water flew over the edge of the ravine. Curious as to what was making the noise, a squirrel who made its home in a hole in the side of the cliff poked its head out, just in time to be hit head-on by the thin stream of steaming liquid. The hapless squirrel chattered furiously at the offending fluid, dashing back into its protective hole where it could wash its fur and rid itself of the pungent substance that had drenched it. Geez, Goten, how much did you drink? Anyway. The lavender-haired demi-Saiyan glared in disgust as his black-haired friend finally pulled his orange pants back up and tied the belt that kept them up. It was only a couple of gallons. Goten protested as he floated back into the air, his tail waving lazily behind him. Lifting himself up into the air after his friend, Trunks shook his head and powered up to go faster. Only a couple of gallons, he mimicked, a drop of sweat rolling down the back of his head. Good grief! Anyway, we need to get to Karin's tower fast, so we can get those senzu beans. Then get back before your grandpa and uncle get back with my mom. That should be easy, Goten giggled. Matching his friend's speed, you of all people should know how long it takes your mom to shop, Trunks? Trunks grinned maliciously as he thought about the torture the two Saiyans had to be going through as they traveled the perilous war zone known as the Mall. He supposed he should have warned them about Bulma, but he doubted they would have understood until they'd experienced shopping with the girl themselves. Besides, the explanation would also have taken way too long and delayed the trip to Karin's tower, which would leave Goku suffering longer than he needed to. As Bardock's feet touched down in the parking area of the shopping complex, he was greeted by shocked and disbelieving stares from everyone within the vicinity. Frowning, he glanced down at his clothing. He hadn't thought it was in that bad a condition. Raditz, too, suffered the open-mouthed attentions of the humans, which was odd because his clothing wasn't even as tattered as his father's. Scratching the back of his head in confusion, the older Saiyan turned to Bulma, who was just now capsulizing her car and popping it back into her pocket. Bulma, why the hell is everyone staring at us? He asked, as they headed towards the large building, trying not to sound too irritated. He never did like being the center of attention, and now was no exception. Gee, I don't know, the girl muttered as she wove her way through the crowds of shoppers. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that most people on this planet can't fly. Upon reaching the large set of open doors, Bulma darted inside the building and immediately headed off to the left where the number of people was marginally fewer. You two better stick close to me, she cautioned the two. It'd be pretty easy to lose each other in this crowd, and I don't want to spend valuable shopping time looking for either of you. There was no need for her to say it twice. Both Saxia Jin tried to keep one eye on their guide and one eye on the people around them, tense and edgy due to such close proximity with so many beings. Bardock uncomfortably noted that the only times he had ever been in areas as crowded as this were on certain planet-clearing missions, and on those occasions, close quarters with a bunch of aliens wasn't a problem for long. Large blasts of ki that incinerated dozens of people in one shot tended to make for plenty of room to walk in. Unfortunately, since those were the only times he had been surrounded like this, he was instinctively on the defense, constantly watching for an attack to come from any angle. Needless to say, the warrior was beginning to feel that what he had thought to be a relatively simple errand was going to turn into a harrowing experience. Raditz was having just as hard a time as Bardock in maintaining his composure. Although he was younger and had fewer experiences with planet clearing, he too was unused to crowds on this magnitude. On an intellectual level, he knew that no one here could possibly pose a threat to him or his father, but on an instinctive level, it felt like he was surrounded by enemies. Every time he was jostled, his body cried out to retaliate, to protect himself from harm. For once, he didn't mind being in the human female's presence, as her whole aura exuded confidence and familiarity with the situation. None of the hundreds of people passing by seemed to bother her in the slightest, and she remained completely unfazed by the thousands of sights, scents, and sounds that were confounding his acute Saiyan senses. For that, Raditz almost envied her. His gratitude for her presence was short-lived, vanishing like a pricked bubble as soon as the girl led them into the first store, a women's lingerie store. "What the hell are we going here?" he demanded in mortified outrage as his eyes took in the room full of lace, straps, frills, silk, satin, and seemingly endless supply of clothing of the most revealing nature possible, all meant for females. "Oh, well, I figured while we're shopping, I might as well pick up some things for myself," Bulma said, dismissing the whole situation brightly. "You two can wait right here and look around while I try some of these things on." With that, she abandoned the two males, snatching a nightgown off a rack and heading towards the fitting room. Bardock and Raditz exchanged dismayed looks, suddenly very aware of the suspicious looks they were receiving from the female shoppers and sales clerks. They were, after all, the only two males present in an extremely female-oriented store. After 30 minutes of watching Bulma enter and exit the changing room, each time carrying a different article of clothing, Bardock and Raditz began to grow bored. While Raditz was seated near the waiting room, trying desperately not to look anywhere except the floor, Bardock had begun to let his curiosity get the better of him. A smile of amusement slipped across his face as he picked up a nylon stocking from a pile and started to play around with it. "Hey, Raditz, what do you suppose they use these for?" he asked, holding up a fist that he had shoved inside one leg of the nylons. His son glanced up long enough to see what Bardock was talking about, and frowned in puzzlement. "I really have no clue. Gloves of some kind, maybe." Standing up, the 15-year-old boy lifted the other half of the thing and peered at it closely. He gave an experimental stretch, then shrugged and let it drop. "I'd hate to wear gloves like that. They look like they constrict movement and press too closely to the skin." A mother and her daughter passed them by, and the little girl looked up at her mother in confusion. "Mommy, why are those two men playing with pantyhose?" "Never mind, honey," the woman said firmly, pulling her child by the arm to the other side of the store. "Some people are just plain sick." Not noticing the exchange, Bardock nodded his agreement with Raditz's assessment and pulled the nylon stocking off his hand, dropping it casually back into the pile of its mates. Spotting a pair of particularly frilly panties, he grinned and plucked it off its rack. "Call me crazy, but who in their right mind would actually wear these? The amount of lace on this thing would surely get in the way of wearing anything else. It can't be very comfortable, either." He handed the underwear to Raditz, who snorted his amusement as he turned the garment over in his hands. While they were examining the panties, a woman passed by and saw what they were holding. "Perverts," she hissed venomously at them, glaring heatedly as she stalked past them. Both Saiyans jumped a little and flushed slightly with embarrassment. They stared at the woman's receding back for a moment. Then Raditz hung the panties back on their rack. Feeling a little bolder, he looked around curiously until his eyes came across the nightwear section. He pointed at one of the negligees, smirking. "Wouldn't it almost be better to wear nothing at all?" "It's not like that thing hides anything," he chortled, shaking his head with mirth. "Can I help you to, gentlemen?" a saleslady asked as politely as she could, schooling her face to a neutral blankness that showed nothing of her true feelings. Still, it was hard, since she was relatively new to this job and hadn't ever had to deal with male customers before. "Huh?" Bardock blinked in confusion. "Gentle men? That's a new one. I've never been called gentle before." He looked around to make sure there wasn't someone else that the woman might be talking to, but found that he and his son were still the only males in the store. Scratching the back of his head in confusion, he met the eyes of the clerk and asked, "Are you talking to us?" Thinking that he was emphasizing the men part of the phrase, the clerk inwardly groaned, completely disgusted. "Just my luck. I get stuck with a couple of girly men who want to play dress up." She smiled an oily smile at the two men in front of her. Money was money, and she wasn't going to turn down the opportunity of a sale, no matter what she felt. Best to avoid gender terms if at all possible. I said, is there anything I can help you with? Her voice was honey sweet, the epitome of polite correctness. What do you mean? Bardock replied in confusion, scratching the back of his head as he tried to puzzle why this person thought he and his son might need help. Inwardly sighing, the sales clerk resigned herself to her fate. It was, after all, her job to make the customer feel welcome and wanted, and to try to get them to buy things, no matter how she personally felt. Well, I can point out where various things are kept, and I could give good advice about what colors, cuts, materials, and so forth go with your complexion. That nightie right there, for instance, would look just lovely on you. She pointed at the nextly the two men had been discussing earlier, unaware of exactly what they'd been saying about it. She thought it might be the kind of thing a gay man might like, but she couldn't really be certain. The mental image of either one of these guys wearing it made her mentally cringe. Regiets, too, began to visualize his father wearing the skimpy outfit, and the mental image he formed made him promptly burst out laughing. The confusion Bardock felt wore off as he realized that the woman thought he wanted help shopping, and she actually thinks I'd wear any of this stuff, he thought incredulously. I thought this was only for girls. Apparently, Earth styles are far more different than I imagined. Actually, we're just waiting for someone, Bardock replied warily, not wanting to continue on the topic of what things he'd look good in. On cue, Bulma stepped out of the changing room, a nightgown and a few other articles of clothing draped over her arm. Are you done yet, Bulma? He asked, hopefully. Bulma flashed him a sparkling smile, giving him a thumbs up as she walked off in the direction of the cashier. Yup, sure am. Wow, I don't think I've ever found such great stuff in so short a time. A chill crept up the two warriors' spines at these words as Bulma laid her purchases on the counter and waited for the sales attendant to total the prices. Short? That was a short amount of time. Bardock was just beginning to get an inkling as to why Trunks had been laughing earlier when Bulma had first offered to take them shopping. It had to have been nearly an hour that they'd spent in this place, and they had only been to one store. Thinking that she now understood the situation, the saleswoman gave the three another oily smile. Your daughter is really pretty, sir, she commented, though she secretly thought it strange that the girl's father and brother were taking her nightie shopping. She blinked in surprise as the teen started choking and the older man looked startled. She's not my daughter, he explained, an amused smile gracing his lips. She's just a friend who's taking me and my son shopping. She's taking them shopping? Mentally, she shrugged it off. Oh well, she didn't really care what was going on as long as she got her money and her 10% commission. Given those two essentials in life, she could deal with any and all oddities displayed by her customers. All right, I'm done, the blue-haired girl said cheerfully as she promptly handed her newly acquired bag of clothing over to Raditz. Here, Raditz, will you carry this for me? The teenager opened his mouth to protest, but Bulma didn't give him any choice as she turned around and exited the store so quickly that he and Bardock had to speed up their pace just to catch up with her. Her eyes darted around the mall in search of their next destination, lighting up when she saw the sign above another store. Both Saiyans followed her gaze to the brightly painted sign, confusion reflected on their faces as they tried to make out the unfamiliar letters. Surf's up, dude! The adrenaline of excitement flooded through the veins of the two demi-Saiyans as they finally caught sight of the thin tower that reached up into the heavens, farther than even their eyes could see. Both boys angled upwards toward the top of the tower and gave an extra burst of speed, almost flashing into Super Saiyan in their haste to arrive at the tower where the one who grew the magical senzu beans lived. Within moments of when they first spotted their goal, Goten and Trunks landed lightly on the balcony, directly in front of the short, fluffy white cat who held a staff, almost twice as tall as he was. Yakurin-sama, Goten greeted the cat enthusiastically, a big, goofy grin on his face. I'm San Goten, and this is my friend Trunks Briefs. And we— Yes, I know, Karin interrupted him. You're here for a senzu bean, for your father Goku, who just happens to be younger than you. Hey, wow, that's right, Goten exclaimed, his eyes wide with surprise. How'd you know? I read your mind, the cat replied simply. You and your friend there are from the future, and you're gathering the Dragon Balls so you can wish yourselves back home. It's all there in your mind. Cool, the spiky-haired chibi grinned delightedly, rubbing the back of his neck in a familiar gesture. Then we don't have to explain anything, since you already know everything we know, right? Trunks asked. No, not everything, the mysterious cat chuckled. I stopped reading your minds as soon as I found out what I needed to know, which is more than I think I wanted to know. Knowing too much about the future, even a future that may never happen, can be dangerous. Still, he chortled, pointing his staff at Trunks, I find it rather amusing that you're the son of those two Hellcats down there. Oh yes, I've been watching those two, and let me tell you, I never would have thought it possible for them to fall in love. I know what you mean, Trunks agreed. Grinning a little himself, even he wondered exactly how it had happened that his mother and his father gotten together. They were such an unlikely couple. So can we have a senzu bean? Goten pleaded, giving Karin his best son puppy eyes, TM. Please? Goku really needs it. I don't want him to die. Yeah, sure, Karin said as he walked over to a pot filled with the small brown beans. Reaching a paw in, he grabbed a handful and poured them into a little brown pouch, which he handed over to Goten. 6 beans, 1 for each of you and your friends. Good luck with your Dragon Ball hunt. The two boys thanked him fervently as they blasted off into the air, nearly knocking the poor cat over in their wake. Why do I get the feeling that this isn't the last I'm gonna see of that family? Karin wondered out loud as he steadied himself. No one answered him, which was only logical, seeing as how he was the only one there. Yeti, my eyes! Bardock cried out, shielding his eyes from the barrage of color that assaulted him from every direction. Suffering the same affliction, Raditz rubbed his eyes and opened them again, promptly wincing as he got another eyeful of the rainbow of every natural and unnatural color, some of which he hadn't even known existed. Now I know what Goten was talking about when he told me about shopping on Earth. In comparison with the brightly colored clothing around him, that shirt his grandson had described, neon orange with yellow and green flowers, seemed almost tame. Oh, quit being such a baby, Bulma snapped as she snatched a blue and red Hawaiian print shirt off a rack and held it up to Bardock's chest. Not quite your colors. Maybe something with orange or green. Rather than putting the shirt back, she turned on Raditz, a gleeful glint in her eyes. But it would be perfect on you, Raditz, she crowed as she pressed the shirt up against the teenage Saiyan, eyeing him critically. The poor boy gulped nervously as he warily glanced down at the shirt. It wasn't as bad as most of the shirts on display, but it was still much more colorful than he was used to. Great, that's one shirt. Here, you can hold it until I'm ready to buy it. Shoving the shirt into his surprised arms, she happily dashed over to another rack. This one will look great on you, Bardock, she cried, holding up a tie-dye shirt with rainbow hues in a spiral pattern. The intensity of the colors was enough to make Bardock cringe, but Bulma didn't care. She snatched his arm and pulled him over to a fitting room. Go inside and put it on. Then come back and show me so I can see how it looks on you. Go on, go on. Despite her inferior strength, the little human female somehow managed to push the older Saiyan into one of the rooms, shutting the door firmly as she glanced back at Raditz. You two get into one of those rooms and put on that shirt, Raditz, she demanded, planting her fists on her hips. Anxious not to be forced into a changing room in such a humiliating manner, the black-manned teen hastily entered a separate room and shut the door, leaving the bag of Bulma's clothing with her. The two emerged, wearing their respective shirts and looking very uncomfortable in them, to find Bulma staring speculatively at a pair of grass skirts. Father and son paled simultaneously as they both came up with the same idea. No, she wouldn't. Would she? Oh, Kami, no. At this point, neither one of them was willing to put anything past Bulma. There you are! Hey, those shirts do look good on you. Ha! You can always trust me to have the greatest fashion sense, she congratulated herself. While you guys were in there, I found some more shirts for you to try on. Smiling broadly, she shoved each of the Saiyans a dozen more shirts and shorts each and pushed them back into the changing rooms. Despite having to try on even more clothing than they thought they would ever need or wear in years, both males heaved a sigh of relief. At least she didn't make us put on those skirts. Pulling the dragon radar out, Trunks clicked the button while the two boys sped through the air in the direction of the capsule house. To his mild surprise, a blip immediately showed up fairly close to their location. Hey, Goten, there's a Dragon Ball nearby. Want to go take a look? It shouldn't be too hard to get, and we could probably still beat the others home. The thought of bringing home a Dragon Ball along with the life-saving senzu beans brought a grin to Goten's face, and he nodded eagerly. Yeah! That'd be great, Trunks! Okay then, it's off in that direction. The lilac-haired Saiyan pointed off to the east even as he reoriented himself in midair. It should take us maybe 15 minutes to get there. Reimagined Goten. Even as he said these words, he was already speeding off in the direction of the Dragon Ball. Hey, no fair, Trunks. You got a head start. Goten pushed himself faster as he tried to catch up to his best friend. I'm gonna get you, Trunks. Together, the two boys raced off in search of the Dragon Ball. Raditz sighed in resignation as he put on yet another of the jarringly colored shirts Bulma had picked out for him. It was a button-up shirt that started with crimson red at the bottom and faded up to a shocking golden yellow at the top with the words "Burn Baby" scrawled across the back in flame-like letters, colored various shades of red and orange. He wore it unbuttoned with a plain white t-shirt underneath, accompanied by normal blue jeans. If it weren't for the eyesore of a shirt, he might have been able to stand the clothes, but Bulma just had to add in that last part of the ensemble. As he stepped out of the changing room for what must have been the 20th time that day, he looked around for Bulma, determined to get this over with as soon as possible, so they could end this humiliation and get back to the capsule house. Weaving his way through the rows of clothing in search of the familiar blue-haired girl, he failed to notice as a little boy came running down the aisle, shrieking with glee as his mother dashed frantically after him. "Get back here this instant, Tudjak!" she cried out angrily. The boy only laughed and ran harder, waving an ice cream cone in the air as he glanced back to see how close behind his mother was. Reimagined, who had just barely spotted Bulma, had his back to the child when the boy smacked into him. Caught by surprise and knocked off balance, the hapless Saiyan fell over and only barely managed to put his hands out to break his fall and prevent his face from slamming into the floor. "Oh, I'm so sorry," the distressed mother apologized pathetically as she pulled her giggling son out of Raditz's knee-length mane of hair. Unfortunately, Turuk's ice cream cone was another story entirely. The half-melted blob of vanilla had landed directly in the middle of Raditz's wild hair and was now dripping deeper into it all the way through to his shirt. Ignoring the woman's pleas for forgiveness for her son, Raditz picked himself up off the floor and groaned as he felt something on his back. It was cold, it was gooey, it was sticky, and it was in his hair. His hair. Not only did he have to wear this horribly bright shirt that could disable an enemy by sight alone, but now he had some kind of icy, viscous liquid dripping down his back. After that first brief and shining moment of humor in the underwear store, everything had gone to ashes. Now he seemed to be stuck in temporal distortion where time dragged by on leaden feet. He was being forced to wear clothing bright enough to scare off Frieza, and he was in desperate need of another shower. This day couldn't possibly get any worse. Distracted by the commotion, Bulma glanced up from a piece of paper in her hands and came face to face with a sight that made her want to giggle. There was her handsome, wonderful Raditz with ice cream dripping down his mane, along with a distraught mother and her rambunctious son, the former pleading with the humiliated teenager to forgive the latter's antics. The blue-haired girl didn't know whether to run up and comfort her crush or hold her sides and laugh until it hurt. It was hilarious. How did he manage to get ice cream running down the back of his head anyway? Bulma wasn't sure she wanted to know. Deciding that there were more important things at stake here, specifically Raditz's good looks and the interesting piece of information she'd just learned, Bulma put away her mirth and marched up to the Saiyan, grabbing him by the arm. "You're coming with me, Buster," she said firmly. She hastily paid for the clothing Raditz was wearing, then forcefully pulled him along behind her. Raditz didn't even have a chance to protest, as he was suddenly dragged out of the store and towards a large pool of water that had a woman standing in the center, water spraying out of her mouth in a constant stream. He supposed it was some kind of fountain. A metallic glint in the pool's depths caught his eyes, and he gazed with interest at the coins littering the bottom. What kind of strange earth custom would cause people to throw money in there? So distracted was he by the various conjectures that leapt into his mind, he never even noticed Bulma's hands descending on his head until it was too late. With a startled squeak, he tried to jump back, as she shoved his head into the stream of water. Unfortunately, the only thing he managed to do was unbalance himself, and he tripped over the edge of the pool, landing face first in the water. Emerging from the water, dripping and spluttering indignantly, Raditz snarled at his attacker. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted as he sloshed his way out of the pool. A puddle of water quickly formed beneath the seething Saiyajin, slowly spreading outwards as more water dripped out of the teen's soaking hair. "Well, at least the ice cream's gone," Bulma replied positively, shrugging her shoulders. Secretly, she smiled. Now that the first of her problems had been solved, it was only a matter of breaking the news to her two companions. Speaking of which, we should go back and find Bardock. I think we left him in the store, so he's probably wondering where we are. Thanking whatever kami this backwater planet had that he could manipulate ki, Raditz flared his energy briefly until the water that slicked his clothing and hair heated and evaporated. After he let his ki fade away, he was once again dry and readily clean, though he was still inwardly fuming about the whole incident. Fortunately, Bulma at least let him walk under his own power this time. Thank Kami for small blessings, he sarcastically thought to himself. Once they were back inside the store, they quickly found Bardock examining the shirts on a display rack. Amazingly enough, he'd managed to find a plain sky blue t-shirt somewhere amidst the plethora of insanely colored clothing, which he was now eyeing speculatively. He didn't really think it was quite his color, but Raditz might like it. Glancing up, he noticed the two children approaching him. Bulma with a mischievous and triumphant gleam in her eyes, and his son with a very sullen look on his face. Bardock's eyes were immediately drawn to the flame-colored shirt the younger Cian was wearing, and it was all he could do to keep from bursting out laughing. Of course, he shouldn't be too amused, seeing as how he himself was dressed in a fluorescent green t-shirt that had been generously speckled with little red hearts, and a pair of tan shorts that stopped several inches above his knees. He hated that shirt, but Bulma had made him try it on anyway. He sincerely hoped Bulma did not buy that shirt for him. It was embarrassing enough simply to be made to try it on like this. Catching sight of his father, Raditz couldn't help but smile a little. At least he wasn't the only one suffering. That shirt really doesn't suit you, Bardock, Bulma said, frowning slightly as she ran a critical eye over the ensemble. Bardock let out a breath of relief at her judgment. The shorts look good, though, so we'll get those. In fact, we probably have enough clothing for both of you now that we can move on. Both scenes perked up so suddenly, and hopefully, it was almost comic. Giving them a slow, victorious smile, the unwitting tormentor held out the piece of paper in her hands like a prize, excitedly adding, "And I know exactly what we're going to do next." Both Saiyans gulped simultaneously, not liking the tone of the girl's voice, and shifted their attention, almost fearfully, to the flyer in her hand. Still being unable to read the Chikyu Jin language, their eyes were immediately drawn to the colorful picture at the top of the paper. It was a picture of a glassy orange-red ball with 6 stars floating in the middle. "I already checked the radar," the girl grinned cheerfully. "And it says there is a Dragon Ball somewhere in the complex. And with you two entering, it'll be a cinch to get that 6-star ball." Bardock had at first felt relief that what Bulma had in mind wasn't another trip to yet another store, and was, in fact, merely locating and claiming another Dragon Ball. Then her words caught up with him, and his relief changed to confusion. "Enter what?" he asked, scanning the page again in the futile hope that he would be able to read the foreign words. "The contest? Of course!" Jabbing at the paper in exasperation, she rolled her eyes. "It's not like we can just steal the ball. No, we have to enter the contest. And since it's the prize for the male half of the competition, both of you have to enter." Narrowing his eyes in suspicion, Raditz quit looking at the paper so he could warily eye the 11-year-old female. What contest? That caught Bulma by surprise. "You two can't read." Shaking their heads in unison, the two males smiled in amusement at Bulma's flabbergasted expression. "Well, what did you expect?" the oldest of the two asked, his eyes twinkling with mirth. "Raditz and I aren't from Earth, and we've only been here for a few days, so it's not like we've had much of a chance to learn how to read." With dawning realization in her eyes, the blue-haired scientist silently vowed to teach her 2 temporary charges how to read at the earliest opportunity. "Okay then, here's what the paper says. There's a swimsuit contest here at the mall in about an hour, and the prize for the male half of the competition is a ball that's reputed to have magical properties, along with a gift certificate for a free massage at the local massage parlor. With the bodies you two have, you'll blow the competition out of the water." Smirking in a way that oddly reminded Raditz of Prince Vegeta, Bulma grabbed both males by an arm and began to drag them off to the swimwear section of the store. "Now come on, we only have an hour to get you two the perfect swimsuits and get you over to that contest." Oh, she was going to love this shopping trip. Seeing the gleam in his captor's eyes, Raditz silently gulped. Proud Siagian warrior that he might be, he was beginning to get the idea that Bulma was the one who was really in control. He had no idea what would be involved in this so-called swimsuit contest, but judging by the look on the blue-haired girl's face, it could only spell trouble. When he had first heard about the swimsuit contest, the only thought in his mind had been how to get to the Orange Star City Mall as quickly as possible. He couldn't help it. Beautiful women were his downfall. They attracted him like a bee to honey. Besides which, he didn't want to help it, and once these women got a load of just how studly he was, they wouldn't be able to keep their hands off him. A sly grin filled the wrinkled face of the bald martial artist, as his eyes, hidden by his dark sunglasses, longingly gazed at a petite brunette who walked in front of him, just out of reach. The luscious blonde, the leggy redhead, he just had to get closer. It was like showing a starving man a buffet. Just showing, not letting him eat. Ooh, how he wanted to get a hold of those buns. Getting in a couple of good pinches that elicited outraged screams from the victims, the venerable old master stepped confidently up to the check-in desk and signed his name under the column for the male competition. He didn't really care about the prize. What did he want a Dragon Ball for? Pulling out his skimpy, bright red Speedo, red, the color of love. Mulan Roshi chuckled happily to himself. No, he wasn't here for the prize. He was here for the ladies. Collecting his pass from the desk, Master Roshi walked cheerfully backstage and towards the dressing rooms. He was in heaven. All those beautiful women changing into their bathing suits only a few meters away. If only he could figure out how to get into the female section of the changing area. Too bad there were guards there to prevent any wayward males from accidentally entering the wrong dressing room. Oh well, he'd find a way around that little difficulty somehow. With a little leer, he thought, it's time to see what angels feel like. Bardock stood impatiently in line, waiting for the contest to start. It was a bit embarrassing, being judged like a hunk of meat, but he didn't really mind. He was proud of his warrior sakes, and wasn't afraid to display it, even to the extent that the tiny Speedo did. After the incident with the brightly colored shirts, he had been pleasantly surprised when Bulma had agreed on his choice of his personal favorite color, a muted sea green. Fortunately for him, the little Anna had agreed that the green would be the most becoming on him. Glancing at his son, he couldn't help a small smirk of amusement. He'd spent more time with Raditz in these last few weeks than he had in years, what with both of them being away on separate missions all the time. It awakened some fatherly spark of mischief in him to see his son blushing and scowling anxiously at what he had been made to wear. Raditz wasn't nearly so comfortable with exposing his body like this, or at least not in front of the keen hawk-like gaze that Bulma kept raking over him. The deep maroon Speedo left little to the imagination, and Raditz's tail wrapped tightly around his waist, as if to provide him with just a little more covering. As the two waited in line, Bulma examined the pair critically. Reaching out, she pulled Raditz's tail from around his waist, exclaiming, "Don't wrap your tail around your waist. The judges want to see all of your body, including your abs, and they'd probably think your tail was a tacky accessory or something like that. Not to mention the fact that I want to see all of your body. Kami, he's gorgeous." Roziertz growled threateningly as a blush leapt across his cheeks, and he quickly yanked himself away from her. Barely able to control his body's reaction despite how relatively brief and businesslike the contact with his tail had been. Bulma's eyes widened, and it was her turn to blush when she remembered the effect that touching his tail had had on Raditz the last time. A tense, embarrassed silence fell over the trio, with Raditz glaring, Bulma blushing, and Bardock stuck somewhere between a sympathetic smile for his son and a wicked chortle at the boy's discomfort. It was so very entertaining to see Raditz so out of sorts. The moment was disrupted as a familiar voice, which originated from behind Raditz, exclaimed creakily, "Woo, sweetheart, my name's Roshi. Maybe we could take a walk and get to know each other." Raditz jumped and almost yelped as the leering voice was punctuated by a sharp pinch on his behind. Whirling around, horror and rage fought for dominance on the teenage Saiyan's face as his eyes took in the person who had been behind him and had just fondled his rear end. Rosie tugged confidently at his skimpy, bright red Speedo, ignoring the disgusted yelps and white faces around him. He knew he was studly, and this angel in front of him, with the spiky black hair, was going to take him to heaven. His perverted grin faded when Raditz spun around. "Hey, what happened to my pretty lady?" Death. That was what was in store for the old pervert. Raditz's fingers itched, burned to wrap themselves around the old man's throat. He could still feel the slight twinge from where the geezer had pinched him. Rage and shame boiled in the young Sigyaijin's blood. Oh yes, he was going to die. Bardock glared angrily at Rosier, having seen the entire exchange, and advanced to his son's side. He had recognized the perverted martial artist immediately. This was the man that taught his son, innocent Goku, and now he dared to touch his other son. At the thought of what this decrepit human had just done to his oldest son, and what he might have done to his youngest son during the period of training, he narrowed his eyes in fury. Seeing the confusion written on Rosie's face, however, Bardock suddenly realized that somehow it wasn't intentional. The man had mistaken Raditz for someone else. The outrage that clouded his vision died down to a cold anger. But still, it was the principle of the thing. Master Rosie gulped as two angry Saiyans stalked towards him. It had only taken him a moment to recognize them as Goku's family. That hair, he should have recognized it before. Not only was he deprived of his long-haired beauty, but the previous grope had lost all its thrill. Glancing down at his hand, then back up at the enraged Raditz's face, he suddenly realized that he had just fondled a male, a guy. No perky bosom to puff, no fun to steal kisses from this source, and on top of all that, it really killed the fun to realize he now had to face two angry aliens who would probably beat him to a bloody pulp, if he was lucky. Backing away nervously, Rosie held his hands out in a silent plea for his life, inadvertently frightening away several contestants as they caught sight of his interesting physique. Bulma watched in horrified fascination as Bardock cocked his fist back, intent on slamming it into the old man's skull, when something clicked in her mind and an ingenious inspiration struck her. Wait. Bardock glared but halted his fist, jerking his irritated gaze to the blue-haired child. What? Clapping her hands excitedly, a fiendish grin lit up Bulma's face. Didn't you see? Everyone who catches sight of him hightails it out of here, even other guys. Master Rosie is competition repellent. We need him if we're going to get that Dragon Ball. Pausing as the full implications of what she said sank in, Bardock hesitated for just a moment longer, then slowly lowered his fist and brought his eyes back to transfix Rosier. His glare could have burned a hole in the wall. We'll talk about this later, old man, he promised darkly. Rosie could only gulp and nod his comprehension, his face a sickly greenish white. Even though the immediate threat of bodily harm had passed, Rosier fled to the back of the line in an attempt to put as much space between himself and the two Saiyans who still glared daggers at him. Several more competitors, male and female, scattered as he passed by them. He didn't notice, too thankful to have gotten out of that mistake alive to care what the other people were doing. The lines were short, very short. Most of the guys had seen Rosie grope Raditz and, not knowing it had been a mistake, just weren't willing to take the chance. Who knew if the old pervert would grope them too? What did they want with some stupid orange ball anyway, even if the contest officials claimed it had some sort of magical powers? Magical powers. Yeah, right. Bardock had to stop himself from glowering back at the old pervert standing at the other end of the line. As soon as this contest was over, he'd get what was coming to him. No one touched his family like that. The women's contest had just finished, and the few women who were brave enough to remain and take the chance of an unpleasant encounter with Rosie filed back in, skirting warily past the old hentai, whose eyes behind his ever-present sunglasses were filled with a love-struck, longing glint. So much smooth, bare flesh. Such wonderful figures. Sweet, sugary candy for his old eyes. As soon as the women finished exiting the stage, the men were signaled that it was now their turn to be judged. Restraining a growl at Rosie, Bardock schooled his features to a calmer appearance and strode confidently out onto the stage, followed by Raditz, a blonde man, and a muscle builder type. The two were the only remaining competition besides Rosie, and finally the old pervert himself. Bulma grinned to herself from the audience as she saw the line emerge. The remaining men were no match for either Bardock or Raditz. They had this thing in the bag. Apparently the audience agreed with her, as there was a stirring of appreciative murmurs from the women as Bardock stepped onto the stage. Bardock flinched, a bit uncomfortable under the hot stares of the women, and his tail curled and uncurled nervously behind his back. Being in battle was nothing like facing the hungry gazes of this audience. To be honest, it unnerved him just a little bit to have so many females. And he noted to his intense discomfort a few males eyeing him in such an appraising manner. The catcalls he got from the more enthusiastic viewers and the words they contained brought a faint blush to his cheeks. For some reason, that only invited more of the suggestive hoots and hollers, and he had to fight very hard to keep from scratching the back of his head in embarrassment. He noted with amusement that not all of the leers and comments were aimed at him. Glancing at Raditz, he grinned as he saw his son's flaming red cheeks and twitching tail. It was nice to know someone was more embarrassed about this than he was. The blonde and the bodybuilders strutted onto the stage and attempted to show their stuff, but they were, for the most part, largely ignored in favor of the two Sanians. It wasn't until Master Rosie waltzed onto the stage, his chest puffed out in pride in the earlier incident momentarily forgotten, that the audience's attention was ripped away from Bardock and Raditz. Bardock was actually a bit thankful that the hermit had stepped on stage, since it gave him and Raditz a brief break from all the lustful and admiring stares they were getting. Perhaps he wouldn't kill Master Rosie after all, just injure him. Severely. "Hello, ladies." Rosier crowed at the top of his lungs. "You all better pull your fans, 'cause it's about to get real hot in here. Yeah, I know you can't resist me." One side of his pale, wrinkled body set most of the audience shuddering with horror. Rosie, of course, misinterpreted their reaction and beamed triumphantly. "Who's ready for some love? I'm the #1 stud in the world, and I'm completely available. Any pretty ladies want to date me?" It looked like the ancient relic would continue on in this vein despite the obvious revulsion of the audience, but to everyone's immense relief, Bardock calmly paced towards Master Rosie and gave the old man a glare that would have melted steel. "Shut up. Rosie, shut up." Cheers erupted from the audience, making Bardock smirk faintly. "Ahem," a woman said over a microphone, and the audience quieted down. "If we could have each contestant walk down the aisle so that the judges can make their decisions. We'd like to start with the contestant named Studmuffin." Rosie's face lit up, and he eagerly stepped forward and began to walk down the catwalk that ran in front of the judging tables. The 5 female judges cringed, but had to force themselves to look at him critically. It was truly one of the worst moments of any of their lives. Brenda, the primary judge and spokeswoman of the contest, picked up the microphone and continued on. Thank you, coughed Studmuffin. She choked out. "Please step backstage until the final results are in. If we could have Mr. Bardock come down, now." A collective sigh of relief ran through the audience as the Speedo-clad Rosie vanished, albeit temporarily, from view. Mr. Bardock, the muscle-bound bodybuilder, smirked as he passed by Rosie. "What luck. I get to go right after that scumbag pervert. The contrast alone is bound to earn me bonus points." Flexing his muscles in what he thought was an attractive manner, the man made his way to the end of the aisle and back. The same process was repeated for the blonde, a well-toned, though not as well-built, young man named Chupika. He too joined the others backstage. Raditz's turn came next, and the poor teenager was once again subjected to the praise and innuendos that floated up from the audience. The female judges all smiled faintly since they finally got to judge A.L. worthy of their attentions. A couple of them frowned at his widow's peak, but the others just shrugged it off. He more than made up for it with his figure. Happily thanking him for participating, Brenda directed him off the stage, then called for the final contestant. Bardock. If he had been uncomfortable before, it was 10 times worse now. Every eye in the audience was riveted on Bardock, especially since there were no others present to distract them. Bardock flushed a bright crimson as he strode down the catwalk, tail swishing gently behind him. From the leers and whoops the ladies directed at him, he felt almost as though he wasn't wearing anything at all, which wasn't far from the truth. In reality, if the reaction of the audience is anything to go by, it looks pretty certain that we'll get that Dragon Ball, he thought positively, nervously turning around and heading back the way he had come. He winced as this increased the number of catcalls and references to his butt and his tail. He'd never really been all that body conscious, but during those few minutes he'd been on stage, he came about as close to it as he'd ever been in his life. Brenda's eyes felt like they were going to fall right out of her head as she latched them onto the green Speedo-clad male. He was absolutely the most gorgeous hunk of flesh she had ever seen in her life. He had the muscles that Miss Bardock had, but his were all well-earned, received from years of practical use, not from sitting around in a gym pumping iron all day. In fact, judging by the scars that could be seen on his body, she guessed that the man was a fighter. The scars did nothing to detract from his overall beauty, and in fact enhanced it. Physical flaws showed that he was not perfect, which was a highly attractive quality in a man, in her opinion. Men with perfect bodies usually made up for it with ugly personalities, or egos the size of Texas. Raking her eyes critically over his well-toned legs, his cute butt, and broad, muscled chest, she didn't forget that she was supposed to be judging this guy. Oh, she was judging. All right. A little grin crossed Brenda's face, and she had to concentrate to keep from drooling. This is going to be the easiest contest I've ever judged. Having finished appraising his body by the time he had made his way to the end of the catwalk, Brenda contentedly began to examine the rest of him. He had a very attractive face, an elfin chin, a strong, sharp nose, large eyes, and elegant eyebrows. And his hair was so wild, she wondered if it was like that naturally, or if he had to use hair gel to get it to stick out like that. It certainly didn't look like there was any gel in it. As Bardock started back towards the stage exit, the judge caught sight of his fuzzy brown tail. How odd. That looks almost real. Blinking to clear her mind, she dismissed the matter. Who cares if it was real or not? It looked pretty dang good on him. A silly smile slid easily onto her face as she gazed longingly at the man's back. I wonder if he's single. Once Bardock had left the immediate view of the audience, the judges conversed quietly and compared their votes. Then they called the 5 contestants back on stage for the announcement of the winner. Brenda, being the spokeswoman of the judges, picked up her microphone and started speaking into it. Thank you all for participating in this contest. The judges have all unanimously voted, and this year's winner of the Orange Star City Swimsuit Contest, whose picture will appear in the Orange Star City Swimsuit Edition calendar, Bardock. A wild cheer erupted from the audience as Brenda hopped onto the stage and gleefully latched onto the taller man's arm, pulling him forward until they got to the end of the catwalk. Bardock was smirking faintly from the rush that a victory always gave him, no matter the arena of combat. His tail was lashing back and forth wildly, revealing his emotions to any who could understand the subtle language of Saiyan tales, and a slight blush graced his cheeks, enabling those not so well versed in Saiyan body language to know what he was feeling. He didn't even notice that Brenda was probably a little closer to him than she should have been. Congratulations, Bardock. Brenda cheered into the microphone. Now, if we could have to step backstage and into a room prepared for the picture taking, we could wrap this up, give you your prize, and you can go home. Even as she was saying this, a man came onto the stage from behind the curtains and approached the duo. He whispered something into the spokeswoman's ear, who nodded at his words, then turned around and left. I've just been informed that the photographers of the usse Swimsuit Edition calendar would also like the runner-up, Raditz, to pose for a few shots. Another enthusiastic cheer greeted this revelation, making it apparent that none of the women in the crowd would mind at all seeing Raditz's picture in the swimsuit calendar. Leading the 2 Saiyans off stage by the arms, Brenda took them to a large side room that had been prepared in advance for the photo shoot. Since she was the spokeswoman of the contest, she even got to sit in on the picture taking, something that she was taking great pleasure in. Oh man, I don't think I've ever seen 2 sexier guys on Earth. They both have those strange tails too. They're probably related, I guess. Happily sitting down next to Bardock as they waited for the cameramen to pick the lighting, she idly toyed with the idea of asking him out on a date after this was all over. He might say yes, after all. She stifled an excited giggle at the thought. One could only hope. The only thing Bardock felt as he exited the room was relief. He had felt extremely ridiculous doing those silly poses as various photographers snapped pictures of him and Raditz together and separately. On top of that, there had been that strange female who kept pestering him about getting together after this was all over. He guessed she was attracted to him, but the feelings were not mutual. Sure, she nice to look at, but he just wasn't interested in a romantic relationship. The wounds from serious loss were still too fresh and deep, and he really doubted that he would ever find another mate. Saiyajin tended to mate for life, and it was a rare case indeed where a Saiyan found a second mate after the loss of their first one. He had no reason to believe that he would be any different from the majority of his people, nor did he have any real desire to find a second mate. For him, there was only Serie. As he and Raditz padded back to the men's changing room, Bardock suddenly remembered the incident with Rosie. Inwardly, he reflected that he had jumped to the wrong conclusion about the old pervert, but he was still furious with the martial artist. Unfortunately, he hadn't counted on having to let photographers take pictures of him after he won the competition, and it looked like Rosie had hightailed it out of there already. Coward, he snorted to himself, smirking. Can't really blame him, though. However, if I ever see his wrinkled old face again, he left the thought hanging, not really certain what he would do, only knowing that it would be unpleasant for the old hentai. Once the two had gotten dressed and had left the men's changing area, they found Bulma waiting impatiently, tapping the toe of one foot with her arms crossed. In her hands she held a folder with some copies of the photos that had been taken of the two of them, along with the gift certificate and the 6-star Dragon Ball. An amused Bardock had said that she could have the free massage in his place, since he didn't particularly want to place himself under the hands of some strange human who knew nothing about Saiyajin physiology and reflexes. One misplaced hand, and Bardock might accidentally kill the man or woman out of instinct. "You two are great," Bulma grinned as she caught sight of them. It was mildly disappointing that they were back in normal clothing again. But at least she had those pictures. She would treasure those always, and probably make dozens of copies. Especially the ones of Raditz. Okay, now that we have that done with, we need to get back to shopping. Seeing as how you two are both fighters, I thought maybe you'd like to go to this little martial arts store that's just around the corner. Father and son glanced at each other and shrugged simultaneously. It wasn't likely that they were going to get out of shopping anytime soon, and as they'd already found out, there were stores far worse than martial arts stores that they could be going to instead. They wordlessly followed their guide on to the next shop, hoping that perhaps this place would have some normal clothing. Maybe the kami of this world is listening, after all. Bardock grinned as he slipped into a sea-green gi and examined himself in the mirror, flowing in loose folds that wouldn't hinder movement. It was comfortable and fit. And more importantly, it did not hurt his eyes just to look at it. He'd also found another pair of loose black pants, much like the ones he'd been wearing for the past few weeks, a black weighted shirt, and a green top to wear over it, along with black weighted armbands and boots. His Saiyan boots were still serviceable, but going by the track record he'd had with clothes so far, there was no guarantee that they would remain that way for long. He might have varied the colors in his clothing more, but the store had a limited selection of colors, and most of them didn't really fit Bardock's taste. Raditz, too, had found some acceptable clothing, some in his own preferred maroon, and some in a muted twilight blue. Needless to say, both Saiyans had already determined that they were going to wear the martial arts clothing when they left the store, rather than the surfer clothes. Bulma had picked out, that is, if they had a choice. In the meantime, Bulma had been looking through the children's section and had managed 2 orange GS like the one Goku tended to wear, 2 dark navy GS for Trunks, 2 royal blues for Vegeta, and 2 sea green for Goten. How she had known their sizes, Bardock didn't know, nor was he really sure he wanted to know. But he shrugged it off and went back to looking through the waist sashes until he found a dark green that could almost have passed for black. Perfect. Deciding that he had found enough clothing to suit him, he brought the small stack of items over to the checkout desk and placed them with the other things Bulma and Raditz had picked. Raditz soon joined him and placed his bundle down as well. The sales clerk, a kindly old man with gray hair and a bald spot, began to add the purchases up. Bulma came over just as he was reaching for the last gi, and she dropped the clothing she'd chosen for the boys on the desk. Mild surprise flitted across Bardock's mind as he glanced over her choices, since none of them were bright or eye-wrenching, unless you counted the orange Gs. That was fine with him, though, since Goku liked that color anyway. Goku! While the man continued to ring up the purchases, Bardock's mind wandered back to his youngest son. Worry began to gnaw at his heart as he recalled how severely the boy had been injured, and the fact that he had left him with only Goten, Trunks, and Vegeta to watch over him. He stared pensively at a clock on the wall of the store, absently wishing he could read Earth timepieces, knowing that it had been a long time since they had left the capsule house. He hadn't felt any of the children raise their ki, but that didn't necessarily mean that everything was all right. After nearly losing Goku the night before, he couldn't help but worry about him. Well, now that we're done with that, the little blue-haired girl said as she capsulized the new acquisitions, I think we should... Bulma. Bardock cut her off before she could finish her sentence. I think maybe I should get back to the house now. Goku's bandages probably need to be changed, and that's not something I'd trust the boys to do. Even with his newfound fatherly concern, he wasn't about to admit to either Raditz or Bulma that he was worried about his son. It just wasn't something a Saiyajin was supposed to do. While Raditz wasn't nearly so concerned about his little brother, he did see this as the perfect opportunity to escape the torture that Bulma had planned for him. Great idea, father. Let's all go back now, he said, a desperate edge to his voice. He had no idea what store Bulma wanted to go to next, but he had absolutely no desire to be left shopping alone with her for an indefinite amount of time. Unfortunately for him, Bulma didn't agree entirely with this plan. Bardock's right, she stated firmly. Someone needs to go back and check on Goku, but only one person needs to do that, and I'm not done shopping yet. Rounding on Raditz, she leveled a finger at him, and neither are you. Bardock doesn't need your help changing bandages. You're staying with me. She had been planning on taking them to a formal wear store, and she was not about to miss out on seeing Raditz in a tuxedo. Granted, since she already knew their measurements, she could easily shop for them without their help, but she saw this as the perfect way to be alone with her crush. Seeing the pleading look in his son's eyes, Bardock grinned and shook his head, his own eyes twinkling with mischief. He knew that Bulma had developed some kind of puppy love for his teenage son, and that Raditz didn't return the feelings to even the slightest degree. In fact, if there had been any sort of mutual attraction, Bardock probably would have been discouraging Bulma from her pursuit so as to avoid destroying any chances of her eventually getting together with Vegeta. He owed it to Trunks to give the boy a chance at life in this timeline too. However, since there seemed to be no danger of Raditz falling in love with the human girl, Bardock felt safe in letting them spend more time together. He was discovering that it was quite fun to watch his son be tormented. Here, Bardock, you can take the Dragon Ball and some clothes for Goku, Bulma added. Give him one of the capsules of clothes, rather than opening it up just to remove one of the orange G's and the 6-star Dragon Ball. Putting both items in the folds of his green gi, he nodded his thanks and turned towards the exit, making sure to toss a final smirk at his son. As he watched his father leave the store, Raditz growled softly, glaring daggers at the older man's back. I'm going to get you for this, father, he muttered under his breath, even as Bulma grabbed hold of his arm and began to drag him off to the next torture chamber in this damned dungeon. Sailing gracefully through the air, the two boys quickly spotted the village in the distance that rapidly grew in size as Goten and Trunks drew closer to it. It wasn't a very large village, but it seemed fit snugly in the valley it was located in. Once they caught sight of it, the boys forgot about their race and happily sat down just outside the village entrance. Pulling out the radar, Trunks clicked it on and watched as the small blip appeared on the screen. Yep, it looks like there's a Dragon Ball here, Goten, he confirmed as he began to walk into the village in the direction the radar indicated. In fact, it looks like it's in that big house over there. Let's go check it out. He deftly put the radar away and sprinted towards the building in question, his younger friend close behind. The house was easily the biggest one in the village, and if the doors were for more than decoration, the person who lived inside had to be huge. Not that that bothered either of the chibis, they were used to being outsized by everyone since they were still children. Besides, size didn't matter in questions of strength. Before the boys reached the door to knock on it, however, it opened of its own accord and out rushed a small black-haired girl in a skimpy warrior woman's outfit, a cape on her shoulders and a bladed helmet on her head. Goku, she shrieked, her large black eyes widening in delight. Both boys stopped short in confusion and stared at the little girl, who was probably only 7 years old, as she grinned and walked up to Goten. You remembered. Oh, I'm so happy. A bright blush spread across her cheeks, which caused her to cover them with her hands and glance aside shyly. Remembered what? Goten asked, confused. He put one hand behind his head and scratched his neck as he tried to figure out what the girl was talking about. The wedding, silly? She exclaimed, sounding exasperated, then promptly blushed again. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. This is the happiest day of my life. Goten was about to ask what she meant by that, but the girl's eyes latched onto Trunks. Well, aren't you going to introduce me to your friend Goku? I'm Trunks, the lavender hair boy said, saving his friend the arduous decision of whether to straighten the girl out about his identity or introduce Trunks. Well, I'm Chi-Chi. It's a pleasure to meet you. Trunks? Chi-Chi smiled and bowed her head politely, not seeming to notice that both boys were openly gaping at her. Well, come inside. We were about to eat lunch, and you're both welcome to join us. Then we can make plans for our wedding. I can't believe it's actually going to happen. I'm so excited. The black-haired girl was already through the door, her cape swirling in her wake, before either boy even thought about closing their mouths. Goten, that's your mom, Trunks whispered hoarsely, his eyes wide in the conflict of whether to gape in shock or fall to the ground laughing. The little girl who had just greeted them was absolutely nothing like the strict, powder-keg-tempered, pan-wielding woman he was used to. Looking over at his friend, he found that spiky-haired Chibi still looked dazed, as though he'd just been hit by a Kamehameha blast. Goten opened his mouth to say something, but, "Get in here, you two. The food's going to get cold," the Ox Princess yelled from inside the house, her patience wearing thin. At that moment, she sounded almost exactly like her future counterpart, which inadvertently elicited the desired response from the two boys. Goten and Trunks darted into the big house with their heads bowed meekly. They had learned throughout their short lives that one did not cross Chi-Chi. Besides which, neither of them were about to turn down free food, especially if it had been cooked by Chi-Chi. Agent Xiao, can you read me? Over. Agent Mai Si, I read you loud and clear. Over. I'm in position to steal the Dragon Ball, but there seems to be a problem. I don't see any sign activity at the contest Emperor Pilaf told us about. Over. Gee, do you think maybe we got here too late? Over. Unknown, hold on a second. I see someone who looks like they're part of the contest. I'm going to ask her what happened to the swimsuit competition. Over. Roger that, Mai. Over. Agent Mai cautiously strode up to the woman in the uniform of a judge and who was wearing a tag that announced her as judge and spokeswoman of the swimsuit contest. Excuse me, ma'am, Mai politely said as she tapped the woman on the shoulder. Can you tell me what happened to the swimsuit competition that was supposed to be held here? Oh, the contest? Brenda blinked in surprise, turning around to face the black-haired woman. I'm sorry, but that ended an hour ago. Is there any way I can contact the winners? Mai asked, trying not to sound desperate. Brenda shook her head. I'm sorry, but that information is not available to the public. Besides which, only the female winner had a permanent address. Neither Bardock nor Raditz could give us their address, something about being in between homes right now. Not that I'd tell you that, Missy. Seeing that Mai had nothing else to say, the spokeswoman continued on her way, a cheerful smile on her face as she once again thumbed through the pictures of the winning contestants. Too bad she couldn't get that Bardock fellow to go on a date with her, but at least she had managed to obtain some copies of the photos. Once the judge was a safe distance away, Agent Mai lifted her walkie-talkie to her ear and said, Xiao, we have a problem. The contest is already over, and the Dragon Ball is no longer here. I repeat, the winner of the contest has already taken the ball. Over. A moment of silence passed. I copy that, Agent Mai. The Emperor is not going to be happy about this. Over. That was an understatement. May winced as she pictured what the little gremlin would do when they showed up without the Dragon Ball and without any information on who had taken it. Needless to say, she was not looking forward to it. When Bardock took off towards the capsule house, he searched for the keys of Vegeta, Trunks, and Goten to use as a kind of beacon to guide him. Vegeta's keys was there, but for some reason, he couldn't sense either Trunks's or Goten's key. However, knowing their love of the game hide and seek, he supposed that they might be in the middle of a game and had suppressed their energy. Who knows? Perhaps they had even included Vegeta in the game. It didn't really matter, since the prince didn't have his energy hidden. The older Saiyan focused on the 10-year-old's key and followed it until he could see the house with his eyes and no longer needed a guide. Landing in front of the domed building, he quickly stepped through the broken door and immediately headed towards the room where his son slept, anxious to check on his condition. Realizing that he would probably need fresh bandages, he made a brief detour to the bathroom where the supplies were kept and grabbed the entire first aid kit, too keen on getting back to Goku's side to pause long enough to extract the specific items he would need and put the rest away. With the kit in hand, he continued on his way to his son's room. The sight that greeted him upon entering the room was not what he expected, to say the least. Lying in the chair next to the bed was the young Prince Vegeta, arms crossed and his head resting on the arm of the chair, fast asleep. A thin trickle of drool escaped the boy's open mouth, and he had his legs sprawled over the other arm of the chair, while his tail dangled over the edge of the seat. Bardock gaped in surprise, jumping slightly when the young Cien snored softly and muttered something in his sleep, the perpetual scowl relaxing just a little bit into a slightly softer expression. Bardock stared at Vegeta for a moment, then shifted his gaze back to Goku, who lay in his bed in exactly the same position he'd left him in, except for the fact that the sheets seemed to be tucked in just a little snugger around him. He looked back at the sleeping Vegeta. Vegeta fell asleep watching my son. He was stunned. Even though the prince's earlier words had seemed to indicate remorse for his actions the night before, he hadn't expected this. Am I reading too much into this? Is it just an accident that you were sitting in that chair long enough to fall asleep, or is it something more? His own face softening a little, he leaned over and gently picked the boy up, careful not to wake him. He had never seemed so childlike before. Bardock suddenly realized that he had been thinking of the young prince as an adult, and not as the young boy he really was. He supposed it had something to do with how Vegeta seemed to carry himself with an instinctive dignity, all the while doing his best to speak and act in a way becoming of the Saiyajin no Oji, remaining aloof from the others. How much of your cold exterior is a facade, a mask to hide your true self? And just what is that inner self like? Carrying Vegeta in his arms, he walked to another room in the capsule house and laid the boy on the bed. As he pulled the sheets over his prince's small form, he couldn't help but smile. If Vegeta knew that I saw him asleep in that room and that I'd tucked him into bed, he'd probably blow a fuse. Don't worry, boy, I won't tell if you won't. In an amused moment of self-mockery, he added, far be it from me to show any tenderness towards the prince of all Saiyans, and the boy who nearly got my son killed. With a rueful shake of his head, Bardock slipped quietly out of the room and headed back to his son's side. He picked up the first aid kit from where he'd left it next to the chair, and set it down on top of the bed, then pulled the covers back to reveal Goku's injured body. He had been right in his guess that the child's bandages needed to be changed. Blood had seeped through the gauze and into the sheets and mattress, though he could tell that the amount of bleeding had diminished from last night. Bardock gently removed the bandage from the wound in Goku's side and dropped it on the floor to be dealt with later. The hole was no longer quite so raw and gaping, but it still had a ragged look to it, and sticky red blood smeared the skin around it. Thankfully, though, there was no sign of infection, causing Bardock to breathe a sigh of relief. He swiftly cleaned this side of the hole, then carefully turned the boy over so he could repeat the process on the other side, then rebandage both parts of the injury. Once he had finished checking over Goku's leg, along with the various other minor wounds, and changing the dressings on them, he put away the medical supplies he had used, and picked up the first aid kit and soiled bandages. He went back to the bathroom to replace the kit where he had found it, then tossed the bandages in a basket next to the clothes washer. Since he didn't know how to operate it, he would let Bulma deal with that when she came back with Raditz. Returning to the room, he pulled the chair away from the wall to face the bed, then sat down in it so he could watch over his peacefully sleeping son. Goku's cheeks seemed to have lost some of their pallor, and his breaths came in a slow, regular cycle. A soft smile spread across the older warrior's face, and he reached a hand out to smooth his child's unruly hair. Hair that looked so much like his own. Just looking at the boy made something stir inside him. A feeling he had never felt before, that warmed him and tugged at his heart. He wasn't certain if he liked this strange emotion, but he decided he would deal with it later. Right now, the only thing on his mind was his youngest son. As Bardock's fingers drew away from the spikes of Goku's hair, he tenderly caressed his son's warm cheek, wiping a stray speck of dirt away with his thumb. In response, Goku's eyelids fluttered briefly, then slowly opened to reveal his coal-black eyes. Bardock blinked in surprise, not expecting Goku to wake up for at least another day, but he smiled broadly as his son's eyes focused on the warrior's features. "Daddy," the Chibi Saiyan's voice was soft, sleepy, but fully aware. His eyes opened a little further, but remained firmly fixed on his father's face. "Yeah, it's me. How are you feeling?" Bardock really wasn't certain what to say in this situation, but the words seemed right. His hand continued to cup Goku's cheek, forgotten by its owner, who kept smiling gently down at his son. "I'm hungry," Goku murmured, blinking the sleep from his eyes. Bardock couldn't help the small chuckle that escaped from his lips, just like a true Saiyan. Waking up for the first time after nearly dying, and the first thing he says, "I'm hungry," the boy wriggled a little to find a more comfortable position, then winced in pain. "And my side hurts too." That sobered the older Saiyan up. Pulling his hand away from Goku's cheek, he ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "That's probably because you had a big stick poking through it when I found you." Goku's brow furrowed in confusion and his eyes became lost in thought as he tried to remember what happened. After a few moments, the blank look faded and was replaced by one of grief and misery. Tears welled up in his eyes as he recalled the events and revelations of the night before, a small sob shaking the child's body. "Daddy, I killed my grandpa," Goku whispered raggedly, eyes unblinking and filled with pain. The tears that formed began to spill down his cheeks in small, glistening streams. Upon opening his mouth, Bardock found that he couldn't think of what to say. There were a million things he could say, but all of them sounded empty and meaningless to him. Reaching out with both arms, he carefully and gently gathered his son's small frame in his arms, lifting him out of bed and resting him in his lap, with one arm cradling the boy's head against his chest and the other supporting Goku's back. He decided that a simple, comforting hug would be best. Goku sobbed again and buried his face in his father's shirt, tears flowing freely to soak into the green cloth. After sitting like this for several minutes, words finally came into Bardock's mind on their own. "It wasn't your fault, you know," he murmured softly, rubbing Goku's back in a soothing manner. "You had no control over your Ozaru transformation. You were too young, and you had no one to teach you." He flinched inwardly at these words, a pang of guilt wrenching at his heart. "You had no one to teach you because I abandoned you. It's not your fault, Goku. If it's anyone's fault, it's mine. But I looked at the MMO, even though Grandpa told me not to." Goku sobbed brokenly, his voice muffled from speaking through Bardock's shirt. If I hadn't looked at the moon, Grandpa would still be alive." Bardock's heart literally ached for the grief and anguish his son was going through, and he found himself wishing he could take the pain away and bring back the cheerful little boy he had met only a few days ago. Hesitantly wrapping his tail around Goku's waist, being careful not to aggravate the wound, he let the fuzzy brown tip stroke the 7-year-old's tail. The gesture was meant to be comforting, generally only used by close friends and relatives, and was seldom practiced simply because Seijin rarely allowed themselves to show such emotions. In the instances it was used most often, there was usually death involved. More specifically, the death of someone loved more deeply than was normal. A twin, a mate, in some cases a parent, a child, or a sibling. It seemed to Bardock that now was an appropriate time for this gesture. "You didn't know, Goku," he said softly, his tail continuing to stroke Goku's soothingly. "You didn't know what would happen. You couldn't have known that you were the creature your grandpa told you about. It's not your fault." In response to either his words or the embrace, Goku stopped trembling and relaxed a little, though he still cried, hiccuping every now and again. "Accidents happen, and I'm sure your grandfather knows you didn't mean to kill him. He still loves you, and he knows you love him. That's all that matters." "But it hurts so much," Goku whispered hoarsely, tilting his head up to look at his father through eyes that shimmered with the tears that continued to fall from them in crystalline droplets. "I know, Goku, I know. The pain never really goes away." Thinking back on the loss of Shiria, he shivered suddenly and clutched his son closer to his chest. Yes, he knew all too well what the pain of loss felt like. But it fades, and it doesn't hurt as much. You just have to let time heal these kinds of wounds. Pressing his face into his father's chest once more, Goku nodded even as he began to sob again. Bardock continued to hold him protectively as his tail curled loosely around Goku's small body. Eventually, the younger Saiyan's whimpers trailed off into quiet, steady breathing as sleep reclaimed him. Rather than setting him back down on the bed, Bardock just kept holding his small son in his arms, finding in the boy a measure of solace for his own pain. Both of them bore wounds in their souls deeper than the eye could see, but perhaps, together, they would be enough to heal each other's broken hearts. Upon entering the house, Goten and Trunks suddenly realized just how hungry they were as their noses immediately picked up the appetizing scents that wafted through the air. With stomachs growling, the two friends followed their noses until they came to a room literally filled with food of every kind, piled high on the floor with only enough room at the edges for company to be seated. Despite how much food was there, though, that was not what caught their attention first. Sitting at one end of the food was a massive, bearded man wearing a helmet adorned with 2 ox horns. At his side was Chi-Chi, who was setting a final dish of dumplings down before she turned to greet the 2 demi-Saiyans. "There you are, Papa. You already know Goku, and that's his friend, Trunks. I invited them to eat lunch with us." The 7-year-old girl walked up to Goten, grabbed his arm, and pulled him down to sit next to her on one side of the food, placing him between her and the Ox King. "Trunks, this is my father, the Ox King." "Well, hello there, Goku," the Ox King rumbled congenially. "It's nice to see you again, and I'm pleased to meet you too, Trunks. Any friend of Goku's is a friend of mine. Please, be seated." Trunks nodded his head politely and sat between Goten and Ox King. "It's a pleasure to meet you too, sir." Feeling very awkward about having his mom holding his arm like she was, Goten reached up with his free hand and scratched the back of his head sheepishly. "But I'm not Goku," he said as he tried to pull away from Chi-Chi. "I'm his so—" Before Goten could finish his statement, Trunks bopped him lightly on the head to shut him up. "Well, lightly for a Saiyan. Anyway, what'd you do that for?" Trunks Rubbing his sore head gingerly, the spiky-haired boy glared at his best friend with a hurt look in his eyes. "Hey, don't hit Goku," Chi-Chi snapped, her eyes flashing dangerously. Then what Goku had said sank in, and she turned her gaze on the boy she thought was her future husband. "And what do you mean? You're not Goku? Who else would you be?" Goten opened his mouth again to explain, but Trunks beat him to it. "That's Goten. He's Goku's twin brother, right, Goten?" The lilac-haired Demi gave his friend a meaningful look. "Just go with it, Goten. We don't need to have your mom find out you're her future son. It'd take too long to explain, and then she'd probably start acting like she does when she thinks about Gohan and Videl giving her grandchildren." Fortunately for the both of them, Goten had enough sense to agree with Trunks, or was just in the habit of always following his friend's lead. Goku's my twin brother." Flashing the girl with his best son grin TM, he finally managed to extricate his arm and edged away from his chibi mother. "Goku never mentioned that he had a twin brother," Chi-Chi said, eyeing Goten and Trunks suspiciously. "And you're carrying his staff on your back," pointing at the end of the red pole that poked above the 8-year-old's shoulder. Her face took on a triumphant expression. "How do you explain that, huh?" "Oh, that's easy," Goten laughed, glad that for once he had been asked something that he could answer without risking saying something compromising. "Goku and I traded clothes, and he lent me his Naibo so we could see if anyone could tell us apart. And he didn't know about me until a few days ago, so that's why he didn't tell you." The raven-haired girl blinked in surprise as she mentally examined Goten's statements for any holes or lies. "But why wouldn't he know about you?" "Goku got separated from his family when he was a baby." Trunks cut in, figuring that his friend wouldn't be able to explain this part without giving something away. "He was raised by his grandpa Gohan, so he didn't know he had any other family until we met him a few days ago." "Ooh!" She nodded to herself as it suddenly all made sense, then smiled brightly at Trunks. "So then, are you related to my Goku too? You have a tail just like him, and Goten too?" A bead of sweat rolled down the back of Trunks' head, and the boy rolled his eyes. First Goku, then Bulma, now Chi-Chi. It seemed like everyone was assuming that he was related to Goku, because he had a tail. "No, I'm not related to Goku, I just happen to have a tail like him. Purely coincidence." "Ahem," the deep voice of the Ox King interrupted before Chachi could continue her interrogation. "Now that we've cleared up this little misunderstanding, could we eat? The food's getting cold and I'm starving." Not waiting to see if anyone had paid any attention to him, he reached out and grabbed a bowl of pork buns, promptly popping 2 into his mouth at the same time. Only too happy to oblige, Goten and Trunks dove into the food with a will, eating with a speed and thoroughness that only Saiyans could pull off. A startled Ox King and Ox Princess openly gaped as the two blissfully stuffed their faces. "Oh, my—" the little girl murmured to herself, picking up a bowl of rice that seemed so measly in comparison to the proportions of food that her 2 guests were consuming. Each boy was easily out-eating the Ox King himself, despite the fact that he was probably 10 times larger than either of them. "What brings you boys around here anyway?" the oversized sovereign asked between bites. Goten and Trunks looked up from their food, their cheeks puffed out with food. Exchanging glances, they swallowed simultaneously. "We're looking for a Dragon Ball," Goten said. "And the radar said there was a Dragon Ball here," Trunks added. "And then we met Chi-Chi and she invited us in to lunch," the spiky-haired chibi continued. "And we were hungry," the older boy carried on. "And since Goku's told us about your daughter, we wanted to meet her. So now we're here," Goten finished. The two had spoken so quickly, one after the other, that the whole exchange had sounded like one long sentence. Both boys took a deep breath, then simultaneously reached for more food as Chi-Chi and her father blinked owlishly at their explanation. "You're looking for a Dragon Ball? You mean like the one your brother was after the last time I met him?" Ox King asked Goten, setting aside the pork buns in favor of a basket of buttered rolls. When Goten nodded in the affirmative, his mouth too full to even mumble a response, the giant turned towards his daughter. "Chi-Chi, didn't you say you found a little orange ball like that?" "Uh-huh. I found it out in the woods and it made me think of Goku, so I kept it. I'll go get it for you." The girl stood up and darted out of the room, returning after a few moments with a small orange-red ball in hand. She smiled happily as she handed it to Goten. "Here you go. You can have this if you promise to remind Goku that he said he'd marry me." Goten and Trunks sweat dropped in unison, and the black-haired boy chuckled nervously even as he accepted the ball from his mother. Upon closer examination, he found that there was one star floating in the center of the sphere, winking faintly with reflected light. Thank you, Chi-Chi, Goten said, tucking the object into his gay, so he wouldn't lose it. I promise I'll tell my Dieter, my brother. It felt really odd to be talking to his mother this way. Not to mention the fact that he had just vowed to remind his father to marry her. Inwardly laughing at the whole situation, Trunks was struggling to maintain a straight face. We really need to be going, he said, glancing out the window to see that the sun was well past the midway point and was on its way to the western horizon. Goku got hurt, you see, and we need to get his medicine to him. Chi-Chi clapped her hands to her mouth in horror. Goku's hurt? Oh, how terrible. In a change of moods faster than the eye could perceive, she scowled at the two older boys. Well, what are you waiting for? Goku needs that medicine. You have to go give it to him now. He still has to marry me, you know. Grabbing each boy by a hand, she began to drag them out of the room and towards the door. If I find out that he died because you two took too long to get his medicine, don't worry, Cha-Cha. Trunks cut in, not exactly keen on hearing whatever threat the fiery-tempered girl might have in mind should they fail in their mission. We won't let anything like that happen. See, we're going right now. Pulling away from the little girl, he immediately took to the air, pausing only long enough to wave goodbye. Thanks for the food, Mom. It was really good. Gun chirped as he blasted off after his friend. Bye. It was a very stunned Chi-Chi who stood staring at the two rapidly diminishing specks in the sky. In the past 2 seconds, she'd just received 2 shocking revelations. Goten and Trunks could fly, and... Mom, she whispered, her eyes wide. She blinked once, twice. Nah, he must have made a mistake.